Catherine had never expected to inherit anything, let alone a decaying, centuries-old mansion nestled on the edge of a forgotten town. The letter from the lawyer had come in the mail one crisp autumn afternoon, its contents shocking her to her core. Her estranged grandfather, whom she had barely known, had left her everything. All his possessions, all his land. But there was something about the house, something unspoken in the lawyer's tone, that made Catherine feel like a pawn in a game she hadn't even known she was playing. Now, standing on the creaking steps of the house's grand entrance, she couldn't shake the feeling that this inheritance had been meant for someone else, someone who could have avoided what lay within. The front door loomed before her, heavy and ornate with intricate carvings of what appeared to be gears and clocks, almost as if time itself had been embedded in the wood. She hesitated, but only for a moment, before pushing it open with a groan that reverberated through the empty halls. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the musty smell of dust and old wood. Faded portraits lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. The house was eerily silent, except for the faint, rhythmic ticking of clocks in various rooms. It was as though every clock in the mansion was synchronized, each one marking the passage of time with the same unwavering beat. Her grandfather had always been obsessed with time. She remembered as a child, visiting him in this very house, hearing stories of his peculiar inventions and clockwork creations. But what she hadn't known, what no one had known, was how deeply his obsession ran. As she wandered through the large, darkened rooms, the feeling of being watched crept over her. The clocks seemed to be everywhere, their ticking louder now, a persistent pulse in the house's heart. She traced her fingers along the dusty furniture, unsure if it was grief or something darker that filled her chest. Why had he left her this place? And why now? Her steps led her to a room at the back of the house, a small study with a large ornate grandfather clock standing in the corner. The clock's pendulum swayed back and forth in an almost hypnotic rhythm, its tick-tock lulling her into a strange trance. The study was filled with books, most of them old and brittle, their pages yellowing with age. But it wasn't the books that caught her attention. Behind the grandfather clock, almost hidden in the shadows, was a small wooden cabinet. Its door was slightly ajar. Catherine felt a sudden impulse to open it. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She reached for the door and pulled it open. Inside, beneath layers of dust and forgotten clutter, was an old, crumpled envelope. It was stained with something dark, something that could have been blood. Catherine recoiled slightly, but her curiosity won out. She carefully unfolded the letter, her fingers trembling slightly as she read the first lines, written in her grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. "My dearest Catherine, if you are reading this, it means I am already gone and you have inherited the house. I pray that you will never need to understand the burden that comes with this legacy. I hope you never feel the weight of time as I have. But if you are reading this, it means you must. You were never meant to inherit the house. It was always meant for someone else, someone who could carry the burden. But fate is cruel. You have been drawn into its web. I will not make excuses. I am sorry, my dear, but there is no escaping what you have become a part of. You are connected to this place now, bound to the house, to the clock. The ticking will never stop." The letter felt heavier than it should have, as if it had absorbed the very essence of the house itself. Catherine's eyes skimmed over the rest of the letter, but her mind was fixated on that one cryptic line, "You were never meant to inherit the house." Her breath caught in her throat. Was this some kind of twisted joke? Was her grandfather trying to warn her about something she didn't understand? Or had he too been consumed by the house, the clocks, the unrelenting passage of time? The letter ended abruptly, with no final words of comfort or explanation. It was as though he had written it in a rush, in a final attempt to pass on his knowledge, to tell her something he hadn't been able to before it was too late. But what was it? And why had he left it hidden behind the clock? Catherine stood there, the letter in her hands, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread creep into her bones. The clocks in the house ticked louder now, their sound filling the silence of the room. She looked around, almost expecting someone to be standing there, someone who had written the letter to her, someone who had orchestrated her inheritance. As her eyes swept across the room, they landed on the grandfather clock once more. The pendulum swung in its slow, rhythmic motion, but something about it seemed off. The ticking was faster now, more urgent. The hands on the clock's face seemed to be moving at an unnatural speed, the time changing before her very eyes. 3 o'clock, 2:59, 2:58. It was as though the clock was counting down to something. She felt her pulse quicken as the room grew colder still. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. In the stillness, the ticking was deafening. Suddenly, there was a soft creak behind her, something shifting in the shadows. Her heart skipped a beat and she whirled around, her eyes darting across the dark room. But there was nothing there. Just the suffocating silence and the relentless ticking of the clock. Catherine took a deep breath and turned back toward the grandfather clock. She needed answers. She needed to understand why her grandfather had left her this house, this nightmare. What was it about time that had driven him to hide this letter from her? And why, for the love of God, had he written that chilling line, "You were never meant to inherit the house"? Her hands shook as she folded the letter and placed it carefully back in the cabinet, her mind racing with questions. She could feel the weight of the house pressing in on her like a living thing watching, waiting. The clock's ticking seemed to be louder now, more insistent. And just before she could leave the study, she swore she saw something move in the corner of her eye, a shadow, fleeting and dark. She turned her head quickly, but again there was nothing there. The room was empty still, save for the ticking of the clock. As Catherine left the study, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was aware of her presence, that it was alive in some way. She glanced back at the clock one final time. The hands had stopped. And for the first time in her life, Catherine felt time itself had begun to close in on her. The sun was beginning to set as Catherine wandered deeper into the mansion. The weight of her grandfather's letter still hung over her, its cryptic warning replaying in her mind like an echo that wouldn't fade. She needed answers, something to ground her, to explain why she had been thrust into this house, why she had inherited its dark secrets. So, she had decided to explore, to search for any clues that might help her make sense of it all. The ticking of the clocks was ever present, their relentless rhythm vibrating through the air, as if the house itself was pulsing in time with the clocks. Catherine had learned quickly that there was no escape from the sound. It wasn't just in the background, it was constant, omnipresent. It felt as though the clocks were marking her every movement, measuring her every breath. She couldn't remember a time when the ticking wasn't there, and it gnawed at her, like an ever-growing pressure in her chest. She found herself on the second floor of the house, the hallway long and narrow. The floorboards creaked beneath her, a muffled groan that seemed almost too deliberate. Every room she passed had the same feeling, empty, yet somehow suffocating, like they were holding their breath, waiting for something. As Catherine moved down the hallway, something caught her eye, a small door tucked away at the very end of the corridor. It was inconspicuous, almost as if it didn't belong, its surface worn down by time. Unlike the rest of the house, which seemed carefully curated, this door had an air of neglect to it. Curiosity tugged at her, pulling her toward it. She reached out, her hand resting on the cold, tarnished doorknob. The house around her seemed to grow quieter, as though it too was anticipating something. With a deep breath, Catherine turned the knob. The door opened with a soft hiss, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It was so cramped that Catherine had to step inside sideways, feeling her skin brush against the walls. The space was cluttered, filled with shelves that buckled under the weight of ancient books, broken furniture, and strange, mechanical parts. Her grandfather's obsession with clocks and time was evident here, in the gears and springs scattered about, as if he had tried to repair or build some great contraption that never came to fruition. But it wasn't the clutter that caught her attention. It was the journal resting on a dusty desk in the corner of the room. A small leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and curled at the edges. Catherine hesitated before picking it up. The heavy feeling of the house pressing in on her seemed to grow more intense the closer she came to the journal, but she couldn't stop herself. She needed to understand. As her fingers brushed against the cover, a sudden, sharp knock echoed from the wall beside her. Her breath caught in her throat. It was too clear, too deliberate, and for a moment she stood frozen, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. Her heart began to race, but she quickly rationalized it. The house was old, the walls creaked, it was just the house settling. But then the knock came again, louder this time and closer. It was coming from inside the wall. Catherine's pulse quickened as the room seemed to close in around her. The ticking of the clocks, always a distant presence, now seemed impossibly close, deafening in its intensity. She dropped the journal, her hands trembling as she turned toward the wall, the sound still echoing in her ears. The room was cold now, too cold for comfort, and the shadows in the corners of the space seemed to shift unnaturally. The knock came again. There was something almost pleading in the sound this time. Catherine swallowed hard. Her mind raced with possibilities. It's the house, it's just the house, she told herself. It's old and falling apart. Probably rats or something else. It doesn't matter. It's nothing. But her feet moved before her thoughts could settle. She had to know. She had to see. She approached the wall where the sound had come from, her breath shallow and quick. The wooden panels were covered in layers of dust, the grain of the wood warped and uneven. She pressed her hand against it, the coldness of the surface biting into her skin. Her eyes scanned the wall, searching for any signs of an opening, a crack, something that could explain the noise. Her fingers found a faint seam running along the bottom of the wall, hidden beneath a thin layer of grime. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and pushed against the wood. It gave way with a faint creak, revealing a narrow opening that led into a hollow space behind the wall. Her stomach lurched as she peered into the darkness beyond. The air was thick, stale, and it smelled of something ancient, something long dead. There was no turning back now. With trembling hands, she pulled at the boards, tearing them away, revealing more of the secret room hidden within the wall. And then she saw it. At first, it was just a glimpse, a twisted, contorted shape pressed against the far wall of the hollow space. But as Catherine pulled away more of the wood, her breath caught in her throat. There, in the darkness, lay a body. A human body, but not like any she had ever seen before. The figure was barely recognizable, its skin pale and stretched thin, as if it had been preserved by some dark, unnatural force. It was fused with the wall itself, its body grotesquely entangled in the wooden structure, as if it had been trapped there, slowly suffocating for years, decades even. The face, though contorted in an expression of agony, still bore the faintest traces of recognition. It looked as though it had once been alive, once been human, but now it was nothing more than a grotesque relic of the house's dark history. Catherine recoiled, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. The image of the body, half dead and entombed in the wall, was too much to process. She felt bile rise in her throat, and her knees buckled beneath her. This wasn't just an accident. This wasn't some forgotten soul trapped by circumstance. This was deliberate. The body had been placed here, left to decay in the dark recesses of the house, part of a terrible fate she was now tied to. The ticking of the clocks outside the room seemed to grow louder, more insistent, like a countdown. As Catherine staggered back from the wall, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house had been waiting for her to find this body, that it had been waiting for her to stumble upon the truth. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the knocking from the wall stopped. Silence filled the room, so profound that Catherine felt as though she could hear the ticking of her own heartbeat. The journals on the desk, still untouched, seemed to beckon her back. But now, Catherine understood. The clocks were not simply marking time, they were marking fates. And hers, she feared, was already sealed. She would become part of the house's legacy, just like the unfortunate soul she had just uncovered. With a final, trembling glance at the body in the wall, Catherine grabbed the journal, desperate for anything that could explain this nightmarish discovery. The house had made its first move, and now she had no choice but to play its game. Catherine hadn't slept in what felt like days. Time had become fluid in the house, slipping through her fingers like sand in an hourglass with the pressure building at the top. The incessant ticking of the clocks was her constant companion, louder now, more invasive. It pulsed through the walls, through her very bones, and her sense of time felt increasingly warped. She couldn't remember what day it was, or even how many times she had walked through the same rooms. Her mind felt fragmented, like it had split into pieces, each one racing to keep up with the strange, unrelenting flow of seconds. She knew something had shifted in the house. Something had changed when she uncovered the body in the wall, when the house had revealed its secrets, and now it felt like she was no longer in control of her own life. The house, with its cold walls and endless ticking, seemed to push her further from the real world with each passing hour. Desperation gnawed at her as she moved through the darkened hallways, her fingers brushing the walls as if she could draw some comfort from their cold touch. She needed to escape. She needed to get out, but she had no idea where to go. There were no phones, no sign of the outside world. The mansion felt like a prison, and she was trapped in its web. Her only escape seemed to be reaching out, reaching for help. But she didn't know who to turn to. Everyone she knew, everyone who had once been a part of her life, felt like distant memories, like people she had never truly known. The walls of the house had swallowed them, consumed them in a way she couldn't explain. There was a landline phone in the study. She had seen it earlier, tucked away on a forgotten desk in the corner. The thought of it had clung to her mind like a lifeline. She could call someone, anyone. She could call her mother, or a friend, or even the police. She needed reassurance that there was a world beyond these suffocating walls, a world untouched by the house's insidious influence. Her hands trembled as she picked up the receiver, the dial tone sounding so foreign to her ears. The silence was maddening, the ticking of the clocks in the background louder than the phone's hum. She didn't even know who she was supposed to call. But something told her she had to act quickly, before the house did something worse. She dialed her mother's number first, her fingers hesitating over the familiar sequence of numbers. Would her mother even answer? Would anyone even care? As the phone rang, Catherine felt the weight of isolation pressing on her chest. Her mother had never truly understood her. Had anyone ever understood her? The phone clicked and a distorted voice crackled through the line. "Catherine, you have to leave the house, now." The voice was barely audible, garbled and broken as though it were struggling to make its way through a thick wall. It sounded wrong. But then, as Catherine's heart skipped a beat, she realized this was her voice. Her own voice, somehow coming through the line, distorted but unmistakable. "Catherine," the voice cracked again, a desperate plea. "It's too late, leave before it's..." The line buzzed, the words cutting off in an abrupt silence. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out everything else. She gripped the receiver harder, as if holding on to the phone could somehow anchor her to reality. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. She was hearing things. The static crackled again, but this time it was only an empty hum. Her future self? Was that really her voice? Was it a warning, or had the house driven her mad? Her mind scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. How could she be speaking to herself from the future? Was it just the house playing tricks on her? Was the relentless ticking warping her perception of reality? The air in the room seemed to grow colder, and she shivered as a sense of dread crept over her. She needed to find out what was happening, why everything felt like it was slipping beyond her grasp. Her hand, still holding the receiver, trembled as she slowly placed it back on its cradle. It had been quiet for a few moments, but then, again, the unmistakable sound of a knock echoed from the wall. Catherine froze, her heart in her throat. It was not as loud as before, not as urgent, but it was there. The sound seemed to travel through the walls, coming from deep inside the structure of the house. There was something familiar about it, but she couldn't quite place it. Her skin crawled as the realization hit her. The knock was not coming from the walls, it was coming from the phone itself. With growing horror, Catherine's gaze snapped back to the phone. It was as though the house was responding to the call. The ticking grew louder, quicker. The room felt impossibly colder, the darkness pressing against her. The light from the dim lamp flickered, casting strange, fleeting shadows on the walls, making her question whether she was seeing things. The knocking continued, relentless, filling the room with a sense of growing dread. Then, as if the house had decided to silence her once and for all, a sudden crash shook the study. A lamp fell from its perch on the desk, crashing to the floor with a deafening noise. Catherine screamed, leaping back in shock. The room was plunged into darkness for a heartbeat before the light flickered back on, and she saw someone, standing at the doorway. Her heart nearly stopped. There was no one there. It was the reflection of herself, twisted and distorted in the glass of the study's large mirror. But this version of herself was different. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and wild with terror. Her reflection seemed to be staring back at her, pleading for help, just like the voice on the phone. It was her, but it wasn't. It was something else, something that wasn't real. She spun around, but no one was there. Her breath was rapid, her chest rising and falling in a panicked rhythm. Was this the house? Or was she losing her mind? The reflection in the mirror faded as quickly as it had appeared, but the terror remained. Her hands shook violently and she backed away from the mirror, her mind whirling in confusion. What had she just seen? What had just happened? The house felt more alive than ever, breathing in rhythm with her own heart, its presence suffocating, consuming every thought, every doubt. Was the phone call a warning from her future, or was it another trick of the house? In her mind, the truth began to coalesce. The house was manipulating time itself, warping her perception and her very reality. It was no longer a question of whether the house could control her. It had already begun to do so. Catherine stumbled backward into the hallway, her mind in chaos. The clocks ticked faster, the sound now a maddening, thunderous rhythm. She could feel the house closing in around her, its pulse beating through the very air. The world outside, the reality she once knew, seemed distant, too far to reach. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Was the phone call real? Was her reflection trying to warn her? Was her future self trying to save her, or had the house already stolen her soul? The answers were somewhere in the house, hidden in its walls, its ticking clocks and its dark, twisted history. And Catherine feared she was running out of time to uncover them. Catherine's mind raced as she paced the hallway, the house pressing in on her from all sides. The air was thick, suffocating with the smell of dust and decay. Her heart pounded against her rib cage, each beat amplifying the fear that had taken root in her chest. The walls of the house seemed to lean closer with every step she took, as if they were closing in on her, trapping her within their ancient embrace. I need to leave. The thought had become a single, consuming urge. Escape. She couldn't bear to be here a moment longer, not with the clocks ticking relentlessly, not with the shadows creeping ever closer. She had already seen too much, learned too much. The house's secrets were clawing at her mind, and she needed to break free before it consumed her completely. She turned toward the front door at the end of the hallway. It was her only escape, the final thread to the outside world. She had to make it, she had to. Catherine reached for the door handle, her hands trembling with anticipation. The wood felt cold under her fingertips, its grain rough and textured. She turned the knob, holding her breath. It had to open. She could almost taste the fresh air beyond it, the smell of grass and freedom. But when the door swung open, she gasped in disbelief. She was back in the living room. The same cold silence hung in the air. The same oppressive ticking of the clock echoed through the room. The same dark, shadowed corners where she had first wandered. The furniture was exactly as it had been before, perfectly arranged, perfectly still, but something was wrong. The room felt stale, like it had been waiting for her return. Catherine stepped back in confusion, her heart racing. She had just come from here. She was sure of it. She had seen the door, felt the pull of the outside world, but now she was trapped back in the living room just like before. Her breath quickened. What is happening? The air in the room felt heavier, thickening with a strange sense of dread. Catherine's eyes scanned the walls again. That was when she saw it, something she had missed before. The symbols. They were everywhere now, etched into the wood paneling, drawn in faded chalk across the wallpaper. Strange, arcane patterns spiraled across the room, swirling and twisting like something alive. They weren't just painted or drawn. They seemed embedded in the walls as though they had always been there, waiting to be discovered. The symbols were unlike anything she had ever seen, complex, intricate, and disturbingly alive. They pulsed in the dim light, each line of ink seeming to writhe, shifting in and out of focus as her eyes tried to make sense of them. Her pulse quickened. Was it possible? Had these symbols always been here, hidden from her view? Or had they materialized since her last moment of confusion? Catherine reached out a trembling hand to touch the wall, but before she could make contact, the floor beneath her seemed to groan. The walls seemed to whisper, faint murmurs brushing against her ears. The house was alive, aware, and it didn't want her to leave. Panicked, Catherine turned toward the hallway, desperate to escape this trap. She couldn't stay in the living room, not with those symbols closing in on her. She couldn't stay in the house at all. She spun around and ran toward the hallway again, her footsteps echoing in the empty silence. There was another door at the end of the hallway, an old wooden one she hadn't noticed before. Her fingers grasped the doorknob with urgency, and she yanked it open. The room beyond it was dark, but she stepped inside without hesitation, hoping it would lead her somewhere, anywhere, but away from this nightmare. The moment she stepped into the new room, something shifted. She froze. Her eyes darted around the room. The air was colder here, the shadows deeper. But it wasn't just the atmosphere. The room itself felt wrong, distorted. The walls were no longer smooth and comforting, but cracked and decayed, as if the house itself had been wounded. The floorboards creaked ominously beneath her feet, but there was something else, something that caught her attention. The mirror across the room reflected her face. Her heart skipped a beat. The woman in the reflection was older, much older. Catherine stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't the same face she had seen in the mirror just hours ago. Her skin was pale, her hair, once neatly combed, was now tangled and wild. Deep lines of exhaustion and fear marred her face, as if she had been here for years, decades even. Her eyes were bloodshot, sunken with an emptiness that seemed to speak of years of torment. How long have I been here? The reflection, her reflection, slowly raised a trembling hand to touch the glass. Catherine's breath hitched as the figure in the mirror did the same, its movements a mirror image of her own, but there was a coldness to the way the figure's hand lingered on the glass, as if it were touching something far more sinister than a mere reflection. The reflection was marked. There were scars on her arms, deep gouges as if she had been clawing at something, at the walls, at herself. It was as though the woman in the mirror had been trapped for far longer than Catherine could comprehend, marked by the house's dark influence. The worst part? The reflection smiled, but not a smile of comfort. It was a twisted grin, one that spoke of resignation, of inevitability. The reflection's eyes glinted with an unnatural knowing, as though it was aware of something Catherine wasn't. Catherine's mind screamed for her to look away, to run, to escape, but she couldn't move. Her gaze was locked on the mirror, unable to break free of the reflection's hold. The smile deepened, stretching impossibly wide, before it twisted into something monstrous. The reflection began to move toward the glass, its hands pressing against the surface, as though it were trying to reach out. Catherine's heart pounded as she realized it was trying to pull her in. With a scream, she ripped herself away from the mirror, her body recoiling in fear. The room seemed to shift around her, the walls bending inward as though the house itself was closing in. The mirror's reflection was wrong. Everything was wrong. And the house was changing her. Suddenly, Catherine stumbled backwards and the floor beneath her feet cracked open. The house was alive and it was rewriting her past. Her reflection in the mirror wasn't just a distorted version of her. It was a glimpse into her future, into the woman she would become if she remained here. The marks on her skin, the age in her eyes, they were all signs of a fate that was already beginning to take shape. She had been in this house for far longer than she realized, and the house was determined to make her part of its twisted history. With tears in her eyes, Catherine turned and ran, desperate to escape the shifting nightmare that was consuming her. But deep down she knew the truth. There was no escaping the house. It had already begun to claim her. The silence of the house was suffocating, thick with the weight of its secrets. Catherine sat on the edge of the dusty desk in the hidden study, the dim light from the single flickering lamp casting long shadows across the room. She ran her fingers over the pages of her grandfather's journals, pages filled with strange, fragmented notes about time, clocks, and experiments that seemed to defy the very fabric of reality. Her mind spun as she pieced together the disjointed information. It was clear now that her grandfather had been obsessed with time, had sought to manipulate it. The clocks scattered throughout the house, each one ticking at its own erratic rhythm, weren't just ornamental. They were the tools of his twisted experiments. But what had he done? And why had he left her this legacy, this inheritance that now felt like a curse? As Catherine turned the fragile pages, her eyes were drawn to something new. Tucked between two worn pages was an old photograph, the edges curled and yellowed with age. At first glance, it seemed like a simple family photo, a rare moment of peace from a life consumed by obsession. The man in the center, standing tall in a dark suit, wore a proud expression. His eyes, sharp and intent, locked onto the camera with the sort of focus that suggested a man on the verge of something monumental. Catherine traced the image with her fingers, wondering who the others were. She recognized some of them as distant relatives she had never met, but there was one person who seemed out of place. Standing to the right of her grandfather was a woman, her face obscured by shadows, but her posture was unmistakable. There was something about her, something wrong that Catherine couldn't put her finger on. She leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing. Something about the photograph shifted beneath her gaze. She blinked rapidly, certain she was imagining it, but when she looked again, the image was clearer. The man at the center, the one she had identified as her grandfather, was changing. At first it was subtle. The lines of his face blurred, his features softening into something unfamiliar. But then, to her horror, she realized it wasn't just his appearance that was changing, it was his face. His nose shifted, his cheekbones grew sharper, his lips curled into a grimace that was far too familiar. Her heart began to pound as she looked closer. The eyes, those piercing, icy eyes, remained locked onto hers, but they were hers. The reflection of her own eyes staring back at her from the photograph. Her breath hitched. This isn't possible. The face in the photograph didn't belong to her grandfather anymore, it was her own. The transformation was slow, almost imperceptible, but it was undeniable. The photograph was somehow warping, altering itself before her eyes, merging her face with her grandfather's as though she was becoming him, piece by piece. Catherine slammed the photo down onto the desk, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She stood up, pacing the small room, trying to shake off the vertigo that had taken hold of her. Her mind raced in a million directions. The implications of what she had just seen were too much to comprehend. Was it possible that... The clocks on the walls around her began to tick louder, a deafening rhythmic pounding that seemed to fill the air, vibrating in her very bones. Her thoughts were suffocating under the weight of the house's influence. She couldn't escape the feeling that it was working on her, pulling her into a fate she couldn't outrun. But then, just as quickly as the noise had started, it stopped. Silence descended upon her like a thick, suffocating fog. The air felt heavier now, oppressive and cold. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing closer. Catherine looked back down at the photo, terrified to see if the transformation had continued. It had. The edges of her grandfather's face had blurred even more, and now her own features, her own eyes, her nose, her lips, were unmistakable. It wasn't just her reflection. It was her future. She was becoming him. She was becoming part of the house's twisted legacy. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her inheritance wasn't random. It was part of a cycle, a pattern set in motion long before her grandfather's death, long before her birth. She had been chosen to inherit this house, this curse, and now she understood why. The house wasn't just a structure. It was a living, breathing entity, an entity that demanded continuity, that demanded the legacy of its clockmaker be passed down. Her grandfather's experiments with time hadn't just been about bending the rules of reality, they had been about creating a legacy. And now, Catherine was part of that legacy. The house had chosen her to follow in his footsteps, to continue the work he had started. She could feel it now, the weight of his obsession pressing down on her like a chain around her neck. She was becoming him, her identity slowly being erased as she was molded into the next chapter of the house's dark story. The walls seemed to pulse with a sickening rhythm, the tick-tick-tick of the clocks now a loud, jagged cacophony in her ears. Catherine looked at her hands, but they too seemed unfamiliar, darker, older, as though they had aged years in mere minutes. She could feel the passage of time stretching out before her, endless and unyielding, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her thoughts were a jumble, disjointed and feverish. The house was manipulating her. The clock's ticking had become a constant reminder that she was running out of time. Her time, but also time in general, as if the house itself was running a countdown to something even darker. Her eyes fell on the grandfather clock in the corner of the room, the one that had started it all. Its hands moved in reverse now, twisting counterclockwise, as though mocking her every attempt to escape. Catherine's heart raced as she felt a wave of hopelessness wash over her. There was no escaping it. She wasn't just trapped in the house. She was trapped in the same cycle her grandfather had been caught in, a cycle that seemed to loop endlessly, binding her fate to the house's twisted nature. And just as the last flicker of hope died within her, Catherine knew the terrible truth. She was becoming the next clockmaker. The house had grown colder. With every step Catherine took through the winding halls, she felt as though it were watching her, waiting, breathing in the spaces between the walls. The air was thick, suffocating, and time seemed to slow, each moment stretching longer than the last. She was trapped, not just by the walls of the house, but by the very fabric of reality itself. Her grandfather's face haunted her at every turn, his eyes now her own, and the ticking of the clocks had become a constant companion, a reminder that time was slipping away. Yet something was different today. The house had become quieter. The clocks still ticked, but their sound was muffled now, as though they were buried deep within the house's bowels. The house no longer felt alive with the same oppressive presence it had before, and Catherine began to sense a shift, a whisper in the air. It was as if the house were drawing her towards something that would either bring her salvation or damn her completely. Catherine wandered through the house, unable to shake the feeling of being pulled, guided by an invisible force. Her eyes fell upon an open door at the end of a long corridor, the faintest sliver of light slipping through the cracks. It was a room she hadn't seen before, but it felt familiar. She hesitated, then stepped toward it, her heart pounding. When she crossed the threshold, her breath caught in her throat. The room was dimly lit, filled with old furniture draped in dusty sheets. In the center, standing before a large mirror, was a woman. At first, Catherine didn't recognize her, but as her eyes focused, she saw the reflection clearly. It was her. But something was terribly wrong. This version of Catherine was older, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones, her eyes sunken and tired. Her hair had grayed, and she looked as though she hadn't slept in years. Her face was a map of exhaustion, but beneath the lines of age and wear, Catherine saw a deep, familiar sorrow in her eyes. It was a version of herself, but not the woman she recognized. This was someone who had lived through what Catherine was just beginning to experience. The older version of herself turned slowly, and Catherine froze. The woman's gaze met hers, and for a moment, time seemed to slow, the world outside the room becoming distant, irrelevant. She opened her mouth, her voice a low, gravelly whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "You have to leave. It's the only way. You have to understand there is no escape, not without sacrifice." Her voice cracked, the words laced with a mixture of despair and urgency. Catherine took a cautious step forward. "What do you mean? Who are you?" The older version of her smiled, though the expression was hollow. "I'm you," she said softly, "but not the way you think. I've lived what you're about to live, and I'm trying to save you from the same fate." The house will take you, but you don't have to let it. You can leave, but the only way out is through the clock. You must die in the house. The words reverberated in Catherine's mind. Die in the house. Her stomach twisted at the thought, but it was the first real clue she had gotten about how to escape. The idea of dying to escape the house was horrifying, but it was also a way out, a promise that there might be an end to this endless nightmare. Catherine's mind was a whirlpool of conflicting emotions. Could this be true? Was this her salvation? She took another step toward the woman, drawn in by her words, desperate to believe that there was hope. But then, without warning, the room shifted. The air grew thick, suffocating. The older version of Catherine's face twisted into a cruel sneer, her eyes darkened with malice. You think I'm here to help you? The woman's voice was no longer a gentle whisper but a harsh, guttural hiss. You think there's a way out? Before Catherine could react, the older version lunged at her with a speed that didn't match her frail body. Her hands, cold and sharp as claws, gripped Catherine's throat, pushing her back against the wall. Catherine gasped for air, her vision narrowing as the weight of the woman pressed down on her. The older version of Catherine's eyes were wide now, filled with a terrifying understanding of what the clock had done to her. There is no escape, you fool, she screamed, her voice distorting as it echoed through the room. You will become like me. You will become her. The words hit Catherine like a punch to the stomach. The woman, her, was no longer offering salvation. She was warning her just as the house had warned her. The house didn't want her to escape. It wanted her to stay, to become part of its endless cycle of torment. With a burst of desperation, Catherine threw the woman off of her. She staggered back, breathless, her mind racing. The older woman lay on the floor, her twisted grin slowly fading into a look of eerie calm. She didn't move, didn't try to attack again. It was as if she had done her part. Her betrayal had been executed. Catherine stumbled to the door, her hands shaking. She couldn't trust her own mind, not anymore. She was starting to wonder if the house had infected her with its madness, or if the line between reality and nightmare had become too thin to distinguish. But one thing was certain, the house was playing with her, manipulating her at every turn. Even the versions of herself that appeared to offer hope were enemies in disguise, twisted by the house's dark influence. As Catherine left the room, she glanced back at the lifeless form on the floor, her reflection flickering in the mirror. The house had planted the seed of doubt in her mind. No matter how far she ran, she would always end up here in the same cycle. She was trapped, just like her grandfather had been. And the clock kept ticking. The house seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy as the days passed, each tick of the clocks now feeling like a countdown. A slow, inevitable march toward something unknown. Catherine had tried everything. She had searched every corner, read every cryptic note, and faced unimaginable horrors, all in an attempt to break the cycle that had ensnared her. The house, though, refused to release its grip. It seemed to toy with her, leading her further into despair. The walls had closed in on her, both figuratively and literally. She had no clear path anymore, only the oppressive ticking of the clocks, the symbols on the walls that shifted with every passing moment. The house was alive, alive in a way that made her skin crawl, as though it had a mind of its own. It had become her prison, her tormentor, and she was beginning to feel the weight of the curse settle heavily on her shoulders. It was in this moment, when Catherine had nearly lost all hope, that she found herself in the room with the grandest of the clocks, the one her grandfather had once used to manipulate time itself. It stood before her now, its glass face cracked, its hands ticking slowly toward the final hour. She could feel it, the end drawing near. The question had become clear in her mind: destroy the clocks or let the cycle continue. The decision, she realized, wasn't hers to make, it never had been. The house had already chosen. With trembling hands, Catherine reached out, feeling the cool metal of the clock. As her fingers brushed its surface, the air around her thickened. Her heart began to race, a primal fear rising within her chest. Something was wrong, something was coming. Then it happened. A cold gust of wind blew through the room, though no windows were open. The air shifted, and with it came a presence, a haunting sensation that turned Catherine's blood to ice. She spun around, eyes wide, searching for the source of the chill. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. At first, Catherine didn't recognize her. The woman seemed to materialize from the very fabric of the house, her body translucent, a faint glow outlining her decayed form. Her features were familiar, but twisted, like a reflection in a shattered mirror. It wasn't until she took a few steps closer that Catherine's breath caught in her throat. Her mother. But she was wrong. The woman who stood before Catherine wasn't the woman she remembered. the vibrant, strong, determined woman who had once been her mother. This version was a thing of decay, her skin peeling and bruised, her eyes sunken deep into her face. Her lips were cracked and bloodless, and her hair, once full and rich, hung in matted clumps around her face. She looked half dead, as if she had been trapped in the house for far longer than Catherine had. Catherine. The voice that left her mother's lips was a rasp, barely above a whisper, yet it was unmistakable. Catherine, you have to listen to me. Catherine's body froze, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Her mother had died years ago. She had seen the grave, stood at the funeral, mourned the woman who had been her guide, her protector. This couldn't be real. But the figure before her, this decaying, twisted version of her mother, was real. And she was speaking to Catherine as if she were still the woman who had raised her. You have to let it happen, her mother pleaded, her voice shaking, her eyes filled with a desperate, painful sorrow. Don't fight it. The cycle has to continue. Time is running out for both of us. Catherine shook her head, the weight of the words pressing down on her chest. No, I can't. I won't let it happen. I can break the cycle. I can stop this. Her mother's decayed face twisted into something resembling a smile, though it was distorted and hollow. It's too late for me. It was too late for me when I was here, when I was trapped in this house. She paused, her body flickering as if the very nature of her existence was unstable. I was the last one who tried to escape. The house, it won't let you. You think you're the first? You think your grandfather was the first? No, the house chooses. It's always chosen. And now you must continue what I started. Catherine took a step back, her pulse racing. What do you mean? You're saying this is my fate, that I have no choice? Her mother nodded slowly, a sorrowful look in her eyes. I failed to break the cycle, Catherine. And now you're a part of it. You are the next inheritor. Time doesn't end here. It never ends. Her eyes darkened as she stepped closer. And if you break it, you break me. Catherine's heart thundered in her chest, but there was more, a creeping sense of horror she hadn't yet felt. Her mother's words had struck something deep within her. She had always felt the weight of her inheritance, but never like this. Her mother had been here before, trapped in the same house, caught in the same fate, and now Catherine understood the horrifying truth. Her mother had been a part of this twisted legacy. She had failed to escape, just like her grandfather, and now Catherine was the next in line to repeat the cycle. No, Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible. I can't. I won't. But as her mother reached out to her, the air around them seemed to crackle. Catherine could feel the clock ticking louder, each second drawing her closer to the moment when the choice would have to be made. Would she let the cycle continue? Would she destroy the clocks and risk her own soul, along with the house's grasp on time? Or would she become another casualty of its endless, twisting cycle? You have no choice, Catherine, her mother's voice echoed in the room, her figure flickering, becoming more and more translucent. If you destroy the clocks, the house will consume you. You'll never escape. You'll become one of us. Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she turned back to the grand clock. It ticked louder, drowning out her thoughts. The face of the clock warped, becoming the face of her mother, her grandfather, every version of herself that had come before her. The house, the curse, it was all the same. Her hand hovered over the clock's face. The choice was impossible. There was no way out. Not for her. Not for anyone. Then a voice broke through her thoughts. Her own voice, distant, echoing from the far reaches of the house. You must choose. And in that moment, Catherine knew the truth. There would never be an escape. Not from the house. Not from time. Catherine stood before the grand clock, her heart racing, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and defiance. The moment had come. This was it. The end of the cycle, the destruction of the house's terrible power, and the breaking of the endless loop that had bound her to this place for what felt like eternity. She had fought, endured, and sacrificed everything to get to this point. There was no more doubt. The clock was the source of the house's malignant influence, its very pulse feeding on the lives of those who dared to step inside. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her trembling hand reaching out toward the clock's gleaming surface. She could feel the weight of her family's curse pressing down on her, the very fabric of her past. Her grandfather's legacy, her mother's failed attempt, her own descent into madness, bearing down on her. This was her moment. Destroy it, she thought, and it would all end. The clock's hands ticked louder, mocking her as if the very concept of time itself were laughing at her futile attempt to escape. Her body was stiff with terror, her mind clouded by the reality of what she was about to do. She didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, she tore through the glass, smashing the face of the clock with all her strength. For a brief, breathless moment, everything was still. The house, once pulsing with an almost tangible presence, grew silent. The ticking ceased, and Catherine's heart seemed to beat in the quiet void. The oppressive air lifted slightly, and a sense of peace washed over her, a fleeting moment of freedom. It was over. The weight of centuries of the house's grip had been shattered. But then, something went wrong. At first it was subtle. A tremor in the floor beneath her feet. The walls around her groaned as though they were alive, as if they had been waiting for this very moment. The light in the room dimmed, and the air grew colder than before, until Catherine felt as though the temperature had plummeted to impossible depths. A deep, resonating hum filled the room, rising from beneath the floor from the very core of the house. The cracks in the clock's face began to expand, not fading but deepening. They glowed with a sickly light, pulsing like a heartbeat. The once still hands of the clock began to move again, faster now, spinning erratically as though time itself had been disturbed. The realization hit her all at once, like an explosion in her mind. The clock wasn't broken. It was never meant to be destroyed. The house was the clock. The walls closed in on her, not as if they were made of wood and stone, but as if they were made of something else, something alive, something with a will of its own. The house began to change, to twist, as if it were reshaping itself around her, folding and unfolding in unnatural, terrifying ways. Then, with an overwhelming, suffocating sensation, Catherine felt herself pulled, physically pulled, toward the clock. The gears inside it began to turn faster, their grinding sound deafening, drowning out all other noises as if the house itself was alive and hungry. The room spun, and Catherine felt her body growing heavier, her limbs stiffening as though they were being absorbed into the very fabric of the house. "No!" she gasped, struggling to move to escape the tightening grip of the house. But it was too late. The gears of the clock shifted, grinding against each other with a deafening screech, and Catherine was pulled, tighter, until she felt herself fuse with the machine. The sensation was not one of pain, but of consciousness. It was as if she were slipping into a parallel existence, one that had always been there, waiting for her. She could feel herself being absorbed into the mechanism of time, her body, her mind, becoming part of the very system that powered the house. Her flesh fused with the clock's inner workings, her heartbeat becoming the ticking of its gears. Her mind no longer held control, it was now part of the endless rhythm of time, caught in the eternal loop. The clock was no longer a tool, it was a sentient, malevolent entity feeding off the souls of those who tried to escape. And Catherine had become just another cog in its infinite gears. Her scream was swallowed by the sound of the clock, her body now lost within its vast, twisting machine. She was no longer a person, no longer a part of the living world. She had become part of the clock. The room around her shifted again, the walls flickering as though they were mere projections, fading in and out of existence. The house reset itself, its cycle beginning anew. The gears of the clock clicked forward, its hands now frozen at the exact time it had been before. And then, in the eerie stillness of the house, something shifted. The door to the house creaked open. A figure stood there, unfamiliar yet eerily familiar at the same time. A young woman, her features soft and hopeful, her eyes wide with curiosity. She stepped across the threshold, her gaze flickering with a sense of nostalgia, as though she had been here before, though she couldn't quite place why. She was, perhaps, the next inheritor of the house. Her story would begin now. But what she didn't know, and what Catherine had learned too late, was that the house, the clock, would consume her as it had consumed so many before. And this time, Catherine's face would watch from within the gears, her soul trapped in the eternal cycle. The figure paused, looking around with growing unease, a feeling of déjà vu creeping over her. She stepped further into the house, unaware that this was only the beginning, just another turn in the eternal loop. The final line echoed in Catherine's mind, her fragmented thoughts now part of the clock's endless ticking. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a muted amber light across the streets of New York as Alice stepped out of the yellow taxi. Her eyes scanned the towering apartment building before her, an intimidating structure wrapped in the pulse of the city's never-ending hum. The building had always been her last choice, but with nowhere else to turn, it had become her only refuge. The sign by the entrance read, "The Westbrook," though the word had faded from neglect, much like the building itself. Alice took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of city air clogging her chest. She'd spent months searching for somewhere, anywhere to escape her grief, to escape the incessant pull of the memories that haunted her. The death of her sibling, the life they'd built together, had broken her. leaving her adrift in a city that seemed as lost as she was. But now, standing in front of this building, Alice had one clear thought: start over. Just start over. The building's interior was a stark contrast to the vibrant streets of New York. Dim lights flickered overhead as Alice passed through the lobby, the walls adorned with peeling wallpaper that screamed for attention but was ignored by time. The elevator groaned as it took her to the 5th floor, the ding of the doors opening sounding too loud, too unnatural in the silence. She was greeted by the apartment door, the one she'd signed a lease for earlier that week. It was an odd thing really how quickly she'd secured the space. No other potential tenants had shown up when she toured, and the landlord had been overly eager to hand over the keys, as though he couldn't wait to rid himself of the place. The apartment itself was cramped but functional: a small living room, a separate kitchen, and a single bedroom. Alice hesitated for a moment as she set her bags down. The walls seemed to whisper, faint murmurs that felt like something other than the usual creaks and groans of an old building. She shook her head, dismissing it as nerves. There was a faint scent of something old in the air, musty wood and damp stone. It wasn't unpleasant, but it lingered, clinging to her like an unwelcome guest. Strange symbols. As she started unpacking, Alice's fingers brushed against the wall next to the kitchen counter, where an inexplicable gouge in the paint caught her attention. She stepped closer, squinting at the marks. They were crude, almost frantic, as if someone had hastily scratched at the surface, desperate to communicate something. Lines intersected in jagged angles, forming shapes that might have been random, but something about them felt deliberate. The more she examined them, the more they seemed to watch her, as if the very wall itself held a secret that wanted to be discovered. The symbols were too intricate, too deliberate to be the result of a careless tenant, yet Alice tried to dismiss them. Probably just some leftover graffiti, she thought, shrugging off the chill that had crept into her bones. But as she unpacked the final box, something gnawed at her. A sense of déjà vu creeping slowly, as if the apartment wasn't just an unfamiliar space but one she had stepped into without knowing it. She wiped the sweat from her palms and went to the counter to grab a bottle of water. Then, in a split second, the realization hit her. The marks on the wall were not random at all. They were identical to the symbols she'd seen in Victor's artwork, the artist who had recently sold her some of his eerie drawings. His dark, surreal art had always unsettled her, but she had never truly understood why. Now, standing there, she realized the truth. The haunting wasn't something historical, something from the past. It was ongoing. The spirits weren't only tied to the apartment. They were tied to her. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't just in an old building with a sordid past. She was in a place where the past was still alive, still lingering like a ghost waiting to reclaim what it had lost. She wiped the back of her hand across her forehead, trying to brush away the dread building inside her. It was an unsettling feeling that had nothing to do with the apartment's age. No, something far deeper was at play here. The phone call. Just as the tension in the air began to tighten, the shrill ring of her cell phone shattered the quiet. Alice jumped, startled, and immediately glanced at the screen. She froze. The caller ID displayed a name she had not seen in months. It was Tom, her sibling. Her stomach churned, a rush of nausea flooding her chest. Tom's number had been dead for over a year. Alice had buried him, buried the memory of the night he died in that accident. He was gone. He had been gone. She was sure of it. But here was the number, glowing on her screen as if mocking her very sanity. It's a mistake, she told herself, her hands trembling as she swiped to answer. This is a glitch. A mistake. She brought the phone to her ear, her voice barely a whisper. Hello? Static crackled on the other end. A faint, broken whisper lingered in the silence, but it wasn't Tom's voice. She strained to hear something, anything, but all that met her ear was the eerie hum of dead air. Then a click, followed by a harsh silence. She pulled the phone away and stared at the screen, heart racing. The call had ended as suddenly as it had begun. Alice's throat tightened as she held the phone in both hands, staring at the name. Her breath came in shallow gasps. What just happened? She was sure that the phone had not been wrong, that the number displayed had been correct. The silence in the apartment seemed to grow louder, the walls pressing in. Her mind raced. Was it a spirit? Some kind of trick? Or had she truly gone mad from the weight of her grief? But no matter how much she tried to rationalize it, the eerie sensation lingered. Something was wrong here. The call felt too real to be a glitch, too precise to be dismissed. A moment of clarity. The phone call felt like a mark on her soul. Her eyes darted around the apartment, her mind desperately trying to pull together the threads that didn't quite match up. She could feel it now, the presence in the apartment, invisible but undeniably real. She was not alone. She would never be alone. A cold shiver ran down Alice's spine. She had heard stories of haunted places, ghosts that lingered in the walls, memories that refused to die. She had brushed them off, dismissed them as superstition. But now, with the symbols on the wall and the phone call that defied reason, Alice was no longer sure what was real. The apartment, the city, her grief, it was all connected. The spirits had found her. And it seemed that they had been waiting for her. Alice awoke to the sound of soft tapping on her apartment window, the daylight still muted by the heavy curtains she had failed to draw the night before. The sleep she had managed to catch was restless, interrupted by the nagging presence of the apartment's strange energy. Her mind kept returning to the phone call from Tom, the unexplainable symbols on the wall, and the gnawing sensation that something was deeply wrong in this place. Her first instinct was to do what she always did, ignore it, to dismiss the unnerving thoughts and push forward. But the more she tried to focus on unpacking and settling in, the more the whisper of the apartment called to her, growing louder with each passing minute. She had been in the space for less than 24 hours, but it already felt like a lifetime. By noon, Alice had made up her mind. She would confront the landlord about the symbols on the walls, the odd phone call, and the increasingly strange atmosphere. Maybe there was a logical explanation for the eerie happenings. Maybe the old building was just playing tricks on her, a warped reminder of the city's long-forgotten history. The landlord's office. The building manager's office was tucked away at the back of the lobby, behind a heavy door that creaked on its hinges when Alice pushed it open. The room smelled faintly of incense, with thick velvet curtains blocking any light from entering. A large, wooden desk sat at the center, its surface cluttered with papers, old keys, and a solitary lamp casting dim amber light across the room. There was an unsettling stillness here, as if the room itself had been trapped in time, much like the rest of the building. Behind the desk, the landlord sat, his posture rigid and straight-backed, as though his body had long since forgotten how to relax. His face was pale, almost waxen, with sharp features that made him appear older than his years. His hair was white, slicked back, and his eyes, dark and piercing, followed her every movement. Alice took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm despite the discomfort prickling along her skin. She couldn't ignore the sense of dread rising in her chest as she approached the desk. "I wanted to ask you about something," Alice started, her voice steadier than she felt. "I noticed some strange symbols in my apartment, and I was wondering if you knew anything about the history of the building. Maybe past tenants, anything unusual that might explain it." The landlord's eyes flickered for just a moment, a flash of something unreadable crossing his face. Then, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, he leaned forward and steepled his fingers. "No history of hauntings here," he replied smoothly. "You're just in an old building. Mississippi old buildings have quirks, I suppose. But there's no need to worry about it. A little bit of paint and some new wallpaper, and you won't even notice anything strange." Alice felt the tension in the air, thickening with each passing second. The landlord's calm demeanor only made her feel more unsettled, as if he was too calm. His voice had no real warmth, no sincerity, just a flat, practiced ease. "I was also told by the leasing agent that the building had been recently renovated," she continued, narrowing her eyes as her gaze wandered over the disorganized desk. "Is that true?" The landlord's fingers twitched ever so slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Renovated, yes, in some parts. But the building itself? It's been around a long time. Some things don't change. And that's for the better, isn't it?" There was something odd in his tone, a heaviness to his words, as if he were choosing them carefully. Alice's stomach twisted, but she pressed on. "I've heard rumors about a tragedy that happened here years ago," she said. "A murder, that the building is haunted." She felt a chill creep up her spine as the words left her mouth. The landlord's expression darkened. For a moment there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it panic? Or perhaps irritation? He cleared his throat and stood abruptly, his movements stiff. "I'm sure it's just stories from the past, Mississippi. Nothing you should worry yourself about. The city's full of old rumors. You'll see with time this building will grow on you." Alice frowned. There was something about his reaction that felt off, as if he was trying too hard to maintain control of the conversation. Just then she glanced down at the desk and noticed something even stranger. A ledger sitting open, but the pages were blank. The paper wasn't yellowed with age like the rest of the documents. It looked brand new. A strange sense of déjà vu crept up on her. She'd seen this ledger before, though she couldn't remember where. Before she could inquire further, the landlord's phone rang, a shrill sound that cut through the quiet. He held up a finger, motioning for her to wait, and turned his back to answer it. Alice waited, glancing around the office. She felt a strange pull to the back of the room, near a door that appeared to lead to a narrow hallway. It wasn't locked, but before she could move toward it, she heard the landlord's voice rising suddenly. It was louder, more urgent than before. "No, no, not now," he muttered, his voice trembling. Alice's heart raced. She was about to ask him if everything was okay when, without warning, the office door slammed shut in her face. She jumped back, startled, and the smell of incense filled the air, thick and almost suffocating, as though the room itself were exhaling. The moment felt unreal. Her mind struggled to piece together the moment, to comprehend what had just happened. She reached for the door handle, but the latch had clicked shut with a finality that sent a cold shiver through her. Alice's stomach tightened. The landlord wasn't there anymore. She could hear him on the other side of the door, but he was distant, as if he'd vanished entirely. It had only been a few moments, but the air felt different. She could no longer hear the faint sound of breathing or the rustling of papers. She was alone. Taking a deep breath, Alice turned to leave, her fingers trembling as she placed her hand on the doorknob. When she stepped back into the hallway, the smell of incense still clung to her clothes, a strange scent that didn't belong. The mysterious neighbor. Later that evening, the strange occurrences continued. As Alice walked to the kitchen to prepare dinner, she heard what she could only describe as faint footsteps, the soft scuff of shoes dragging on the carpet. The sound wasn't coming from her apartment, it was coming from the hallway outside. At first, she hesitated, assuming it was another tenant returning from work. But when she glanced through the peephole, her breath caught in her throat. The door to the apartment next to hers, the one that had been vacant when she first moved in, was wide open. Alice's heart skipped a beat. She had seen the apartment during her initial walkthrough, and it had been completely empty. So why was the door open now? She stepped closer, her curiosity pulling her forward against her better judgment. The soft sound of music playing inside, something old, almost from another time, caught her attention as she slowly approached the threshold. The apartment, when Alice peered inside, was a snapshot frozen in the 1970s. The furniture was garish and outdated, floral print armchairs, wood paneling, faded wallpaper. The air smelled faintly of old cigarettes and dust. The entire apartment seemed as though it had been untouched by time, frozen in a distant decade, as though it hadn't been lived in for decades. Alice blinked, unsure if she was seeing things. She had seen the apartment before, had even looked inside the windows, and it was completely barren. But this was an entirely different world. Everything was perfectly arranged, as if someone had just stepped out. As if the apartment were still occupied, even though the landlord had assured her no one had lived there in years. A cold wave washed over Alice. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with something she couldn't explain. Time was slipping, warping in ways that shouldn't be possible. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the music stopped. The apartment fell silent. Alice's pulse quickened. She stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest. The door to the apartment next door was still ajar, but the inside was now eerily still. She didn't wait to see more. There was no need to investigate further. She knew that something had changed, again. The apartment, the landlord, the strange symbols on the walls, it was all connected. And Alice was no longer sure she was just a bystander in this twisted web. Alice's hands trembled as she opened the door to her apartment the next morning. The world outside her window was shrouded in fog, a dense haze that swallowed the city's towering skyline, blurring it into a sea of indistinct shapes. The air felt thick with something unsettling, as if the atmosphere itself had been altered, weighed down by the heavy presence that lingered in the walls of the building. As she stood there, the events of the past few days replayed in her mind like a warped film reel. Victor's haunting drawings, the phone call from Tom's number, the disappearance of the landlord. And then there was the apartment next door, the one frozen in time. But even more pressing was the gnawing feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. She couldn't shake the sensation that the spirits had become aware of her presence, that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Every corner of the apartment seemed to hold a secret, and with each passing hour, she grew more consumed by the dread that twisted in her stomach. The knock on her door broke her from her thoughts, sharp and urgent. Alice's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, she found Victor standing there, his face pale and hollow, his eyes wide and full of an almost unnatural intensity. "Victor?" she asked, her voice tentative. She hadn't seen him in person since their last meeting, when he had shown her his unsettling artwork. His presence now felt different. The air felt colder, the silence between them heavier. Victor stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. his gaze flickering nervously behind him as though he were checking to see if someone, or something, was following him. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low and urgent. His hand gripped the edge of the door frame, knuckles white with tension. Alice closed the door slowly, locking it behind her. "What's going on?" she asked, her stomach knotting with unease. Victor looked around the room, his gaze resting for a moment on the symbols etched into the walls. His lips twitched, a strange grimace crossing his face. For a moment he didn't speak. Then, in a voice that barely above a whisper, he said, "You've seen the signs. The things that mark this place. The symbols, they're just the beginning." Alice felt a chill crawl up her spine. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to acknowledge that everything she had experienced so far was part of something far darker than she could comprehend. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. "The woman," he continued, his voice growing more strained. "I've seen her. I've spoken to her. I was with her before." Alice stared at him, confused. "What do you mean, before?" Victor turned his gaze toward the floor, and Alice followed his line of sight. His eyes softened, though a tremor passed through his body as he spoke. Her name was Eleanor. She was the one who died, the one the curse was meant to trap. The way he said it, trap, made Alice's blood run cold. The room suddenly felt too small, suffocating, as if the very air had been poisoned by the weight of his confession. I was in love with her," Victor whispered, his voice cracking. "And I was the one who helped perform the ritual that cursed this building. I didn't know what we were unleashing. I thought it was just an experiment, a way to connect with something beyond. But we were fools. The ritual, it was wrong." He paused, his expression growing haunted as he met her gaze. "I didn't know the cost. The woman, Eleanor, her spirit was bound here, trapped by the curse. And for years I've been paying the price." Alice's heart pounded as she tried to process his words. You helped curse the building?" Victor nodded, a haunted look crossing his face. "Yes. I thought I could control it, control her spirit, but I was wrong. She became something more, something angry. She's been tormenting me ever since, whispering to me, trying to get me to finish what we started, to set her free." His voice grew quieter, as if the very act of speaking the truth made it more real. "I didn't come here to hurt you, Alice. I didn't. I thought maybe if I warned you I could stop this. I could stop the curse. I'm sorry, so sorry for what I did." Alice took a step back, her mind reeling. Victor had been part of the curse? The thought left her breathless, her mind struggling to make sense of the twisted pieces falling into place. Everything that had happened to her, the symbols, the strange occurrences, had been because of a ritual Victor had been involved in? You're telling me that you're the reason this is happening to me?" Alice's voice trembled with a mix of fear and anger. Victor nodded, looking at her with those hollow, remorseful eyes. "Yes, I was weak, Alice. And now she's coming for both of us." Alice swallowed hard, her throat tight. She didn't know whether to believe him, or if he was just another part of the madness, trying to pull her deeper into this nightmare. But something about the rawness in his eyes, the pain in his voice, made her want to believe him even though every part of her screamed to run. "I can't stop it. I can't escape her," Victor said quietly, almost to himself. "But you can. You're still alive, Alice. You can break the curse if you know how." Alice opened her mouth to ask him how, but before she could speak, a strange sensation washed over her. The room seemed to shift, the air growing thick and suffocating. And then, with chilling clarity, she realized something that made her blood freeze. Victor was standing too still. His presence felt wrong. She looked at him again, studying his face, trying to ignore the feeling growing inside her. The unease gnawed at her, sharp and persistent, like a whisper in the back of her mind. The coldness in the air felt heavier, thicker. She could feel the pressure closing in. "Victor," she said, her voice trembling. Are you alive?" Victor's eyes flickered, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. But it wasn't a smile. It was something darker, deeper. "You don't understand, Alice," he said, his voice suddenly distant, hollow. "I've been dead for months. I've been dead since the day I performed the ritual." Alice recoiled, her heart slamming against her ribs as she stumbled back. "What? No, that can't be right." But as the words left her mouth, the truth hit her like a tidal wave. Victor's face, his form, his very presence, it was wrong. There was something spectral about him, something unnatural. She had seen it from the very beginning, but now it was undeniable. The man she had been talking to was not alive. He had been dead all along. "I'm here," Victor continued, his voice low, almost pitying. Because I'm bound to this curse just like you. I tried to warn you, to help you, but I failed. It was always too late. His eyes darkened, a shadow flickering across his face. I'm the messenger, Alice, and I'll be here watching as the curse unfolds. You won't escape it. Suddenly, without another word, Victor began to fade. His body lost substance like smoke dissolving into the air. Alice stood frozen in place, unable to speak, unable to move. And just like that, he was gone. The room was silent once more, the echo of his voice still reverberating in her ears. Alice stumbled back, her mind reeling. Victor had been dead? He had been manipulating her all along? She gasped for air, her chest tightening as the reality of the situation settled in. The warning he had given her, was it real? Was it a way to redeem himself, or had it been another manipulation to trap her further? The apartment felt colder now, the presence of the spirits heavier than before. The walls, once merely ominous, now seemed to close in on her, their whispers growing louder. Alice knew with certainty that the curse wasn't just on the building, it was already beginning to consume her. The night felt endless, a heavy, suffocating blanket that wrapped itself around Alice as she paced the apartment. Her mind was a storm of confusion and dread, Victor's cryptic warnings still reverberating in her ears. The mystery of the building, the strange symbols, the ghostly apparitions. It all felt like too much for her to handle. But the one truth that had remained undeniable was that she couldn't run anymore. The curse had already started to unravel, and she was tangled in its threads. She glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. A silence filled the apartment, thick and oppressive. But that silence didn't feel safe anymore. It felt like the calm before something violent, something inevitable, something wrong. The room suddenly chilled, and Alice's breath came out in a visible puff. Her heart thudded in her chest as the temperature dropped further. She froze, instinctively sensing that someone, was about to appear. The air grew heavy, thick with anticipation. The door to her bedroom creaked open by itself. Alice's pulse quickened. She didn't need to look, she already knew what was coming. The presence, the one that had haunted her dreams and thoughts, was now here, real and tangible, like a dark cloud rolling in. With a slow, deliberate movement, Alice turned to face the room, and there, standing by the window, bathed in a ghostly, unnatural light, was the woman she had been avoiding. The woman she now knew was no mere specter, but a force tied to her very existence. The air grew so cold that Alice could feel her teeth aching from the sharpness of it, as though the temperature had plunged into some forgotten place between life and death. The woman's figure shimmered, translucent yet solid, her dark eyes locked onto Alice with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The long, flowing dress the spirit wore seemed to billow in an unseen wind, and her pale face, once beautiful in life, was now twisted with a sadness and fury that radiated from her every pore. Alice. The ghost's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it echoed throughout the room as if it was being spoken by a dozen voices all at once. It's time you remembered. The words sent a shock through Alice's body, and for a moment she stood frozen, unable to breathe. She wanted to run, wanted to flee, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. Her heart pounded in her chest as her eyes refused to leave the ghostly woman. There was something about her, something inexplicable and terrifying. "What do you want from me?" Alice managed to say, her voice shaky, barely a whisper of its usual strength. "Why are you here?" The woman's lips curled into a twisted smile. "I've always been here, Alice. You just never wanted to see me." Her voice grew deeper, almost mocking. "You can't hide from the past forever." Alice's mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. There was something familiar about the woman, something deeply rooted in her own memories. She felt an instinctual pull, like a part of her soul was recognizing the figure before her, even though she had no idea why. The ghost slowly stepped forward, her ghostly form floating closer with every passing moment. "You were just a child when it happened, but you've buried the truth deep within you. Do you remember?" The air around Alice thickened as the ghost's presence became overwhelming. Alice felt her breath catch in her throat. "What do you mean?" Her voice faltered as she began to feel something clawing at the back of her mind, trying to break free. A memory, half forgotten, bubbling to the surface. But it wasn't a simple memory, it was something darker. The ghost took another step forward, and suddenly the world seemed to spin around Alice. The apartment melted away, and a vision overtook her, of a different time, a different place. It was as if she had been transported back into her own past. She was a little girl again, standing in the hallway of the building, her building, but it was different. It was brighter, newer. The walls were fresh with paint, the air warmer. She heard laughter, but it was distant, muffled. There were shadows lurking around every corner, and a sense of something wrong in the air, a tension that she couldn't quite understand. Then the vision sharpened. Her mother's face, familiar but worn and filled with a sense of dread, emerged from the fog of the memory. The image was clear now. Alice's mother was standing near the very spot where Alice now stood, but her expression was one of terror, as if she was trying to escape from something, or someone. Suddenly Alice saw it, him. The man her mother had been running from. He was standing there too, his features obscured by shadow, but his eyes gleamed with malice. He was holding something in his hand, a knife, its edge gleaming with the promise of violence. The vision shattered, and Alice gasped for air, her chest tightening as her heart raced. The ghost's voice echoed in her ears. "Do you remember now, Alice? You were here when it happened. You've always been here. Your mother? She was the one who died, but she wasn't the first. We were the first victims. The couple you found in the attic, they were connected to your family and to the curse." Alice's legs felt like jelly as she stumbled backward, clutching her chest. The weight of the revelation was crushing. Her mother, the murdered woman, had been her mother. The memory she had buried so deep in her mind, the trauma, the grief, it was all tied to this cursed building. Her mother had been killed by the very man who had cursed the building. The curse, the ghosts, the ritual, it was all connected. "No. No, this can't be real," Alice whispered, her voice trembling as she sank to her knees. The ghost, now more solid and defined, knelt before her. She reached out a translucent hand, her fingers brushing against Alice's cheek. "You're the key, Alice. The only one who can end this, if you can face what you've buried." Alice's head spun, the weight of the ghost's words pressing down on her. Her mind raced as she tried to process everything. The truth of her past, her mother's death, was the reason the curse had latched onto her. It wasn't just her presence in the building. It was the blood that ran through her veins, the blood that tied her to the tragedy that had begun all those years ago. The ghost's form began to flicker as if the energy sustaining it was fading. "You're the only one who can break the curse, Alice. But you have to face what you've forgotten. You must remember everything, the truth that lies in the walls of this place." As the last words echoed in Alice's ears, the ghost vanished, leaving behind nothing but the haunting silence of the apartment. Alice sat there in the darkness, trembling as she tried to piece together the fragments of her past. She had been drawn back to the place where it all began, where her mother had died, and now she had no choice but to confront the truth she had repressed for so long. The curse wasn't just on the building, it was tied to her, to the bloodline, to the secrets buried in the past. The walls seemed to close in on her once more, but this time she wasn't alone. The ghosts were with her, speaking, haunting her, urging her to remember. The air in Alice's apartment had grown unbearably thick, charged with a suffocating energy that pressed down on her chest. She had been awake for hours, unable to sleep, unable to silence the relentless pounding in her mind. The ghost's cryptic words from the previous night kept echoing, swirling around her thoughts like a dark cloud, urging her to seek out the truth buried within the very walls of the building. Her skin tingled with the heavy sense of something important and terrifying that was waiting to be uncovered. Her instincts told her the answers were close, within the apartment itself, and so she began to search, methodically tearing apart the room. Every object, every loose floorboard, every crevice in the walls felt like a potential clue, a piece of the puzzle she had yet to solve. But with every passing minute, the place seemed to close in on her more and more. As her fingers brushed over the peeling wallpaper in the corner of the living room, a hidden seam caught her attention. With trembling hands, Alice peeled back the paper, revealing a small compartment behind it. A strange chill swept through the room as she pried the hidden space open. Inside, nestled between yellowing pages and old fabric, was an old leather-bound diary. Her heart raced as she picked it up, the weight of it sending a strange ripple through her chest. She hesitated for only a moment before flipping open the first page. The handwriting was meticulous, elegant, each word carefully inscribed. She could feel the presence of something ancient, something dark, pressing against her as she read. The diary belonged to a man named Edmund Hollis, the building's first tenant. The more Alice read, the more the sense of dread grew. Hollis had been a practitioner of occult rituals, a man who sought to bind spirits to the physical realm in exchange for unimaginable power. The deeper Alice read, the more disturbing the details became. One passage made her stomach churn. "The ritual is nearly complete. To gain true dominion over this place, I must offer the life of one bound to my bloodline. A sacrifice is necessary. The chosen one will be the final piece of the puzzle. the life of my flesh and blood, to cement the power and bind the spirits forever to the land they haunt. Alice's pulse quickened as she reached the final horrifying line. The ritual will be completed with the death of my daughter, and through her sacrifice, I shall unlock dominion over the spirits trapped here, binding them to me for eternity. Her breath caught in her throat as a cold wave of realization washed over her. Her bloodline. Alice's chest tightened, her fingers trembling as they gripped the pages. The ritual had been meant for her. Her own family, her own ancestors, had been part of this curse. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in on her, and for the first time, she truly understood the depth of the horror that had been passed down through generations. Before she could process the full extent of the revelation, the room around her began to shift. It was subtle at first, a quiet shift in the air, a distortion in the light. Then the apartment itself seemed to come alive in a horrifying way. The walls, once solid and familiar, began to warp and groan, stretching and twisting like the flesh of some grotesque being. The air grew thick, heavier than before, and an unsettling hum filled the space. Alice stumbled backward, her pulse thudding in her ears. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes darted around, unable to grasp what was happening. The furniture began to rotate slowly on its own, chairs spinning in place as if moved by invisible hands. The room felt like it was breathing, the walls undulating like a living thing, and Alice could hear faint whispers, soft and insistent, coming from the very wood and plaster around her. Next. The word sent a chill through her, the faintest echo of something malevolent, something ancient pressing against her mind. Then, as if the apartment had a mind of its own, the walls shifted further, the once neutral wallpaper now peeling away to reveal grotesque images. They weren't just strange patterns, they were faces, twisted, contorted faces of her ancestors. Each one leered down at her, their expressions filled with malice, as though they had all conspired in silence to bring her here to this moment. Her bloodline, Alice thought again, her mind racing. She could almost hear the whispering coming from the walls themselves. It was as if the spirits within the building were speaking directly to her, their voices joining the hum that had grown louder, more distinct. Then a sudden searing pain exploded across her skin. She cried out, clutching her arms as a strange symbol, an intricate, foreign design, began to appear on her forearm. It burned like a brand, the skin beneath it writhing as if the symbol was not just ink but a living thing, eating into her flesh, etching its mark into her very being. The symbol pulsed, and with each pulse, Alice felt herself sinking deeper into the nightmare-like version of her apartment. The sound of her ancestors' whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they drowned out all other noise. The apartment seemed to stretch and twist even further, the air now thick with dread and malevolence. You are the next, the final piece. The voices of the dead seemed to chant in unison, rising in volume. Their collective power vibrated in her bones, and she could feel herself losing control. The walls, the whispers, the very space around her were closing in. Suddenly, the apartment lurched violently, as though it was shaking under the weight of an unseen force. Alice staggered, her legs buckling beneath her as the world around her spun into chaos. The room shifted in and out of focus, the furniture becoming distorted, the images of her ancestors mutating into grotesque, snarling figures. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the apartment fell silent. The furniture froze mid-spin. The walls stopped shifting, returning to their original form, albeit now scarred and twisted by the unnatural occurrence. The burning sensation on Alice's skin subsided, but the symbol remained, dark and distinct, forever etched into her flesh. Breathing heavily, her heart still hammering in her chest, Alice stumbled back to her feet. The room had returned to normal for the cursed building at least, but she was no longer the same. She could feel the weight of the curse bearing down on her like never before. She had been marked. She wasn't just a part of the haunting anymore, she was its key, its next victim. She looked down at her arm, where the symbol still burned faintly under her skin. A sense of foreboding washed over her. The ritual had begun, and she was now the one trapped in its cycle. With no time to lose, Alice knew that the truth she had uncovered in the diary was only the beginning. The walls had whispered their warning, and now it was clear. If she didn't find a way to break the curse, she would be the next sacrifice to complete the ritual. The streets of New York felt different now. Alice could sense it in the air, an unnatural stillness, a heaviness that seemed to press down on everything around her. The city's heartbeat, which had once thrummed with the energy of 1,000 souls, now seemed muted, distant, as if the very life of the metropolis was being drained away. The curse that had once been contained to the apartment building had spread. She didn't know how it had happened, but it was clear now. The darkness had seeped into the streets, taking root in the very fabric of New York City. At first, it had been small things: a strange fog rolling in at night, a man on the corner who spoke to shadows instead of people, the faint, almost imperceptible whisper of voices when the wind blew. But now, Alice began to hear stories from people she met, strange encounters that were too consistent to be mere coincidences. The city was changing, the supernatural force had stretched far beyond the building, and it was feeding off something darker, something deeper. Her thoughts raced as she stood at the subway entrance. She had been tracking down any possible lead to break the curse, but now she had to see it for herself. She couldn't escape this nightmare anymore. It had grown too large, too terrifying, and too real. She stepped onto the platform, the usual hum of the station now feeling alien, out of place. The subway car pulled into the station with an eerie screech, the doors sliding open to reveal a group of commuters, all strangely silent. The normal bustle, the life of New York's underground, was missing, replaced by an unsettling calm. Alice took a deep breath and entered the car, her footsteps echoing loudly in the confined space. At first, it was just another ride, people sitting quietly, eyes glued to their phones, some reading, others gazing out the window. But then Alice felt it. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered in a sickening rhythm, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The murmurs of the passengers grew faint, their conversations distorted by an otherworldly hum. Something wasn't right. She turned to face the woman sitting next to her, a middle-aged woman in a worn-out coat, her face pale and gaunt. But as Alice looked closer, her stomach dropped. The woman's face was wrong. Her skin was discolored, blotchy, and stretched too thin, as if it were clinging to a hollowed-out skull. Her eyes were glassy, dull, and void of any light, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque, toothless grin. Before Alice could react, the woman's form began to warp, her body cracking and shifting unnaturally. Her arms elongated, her fingers curled into skeletal claws, and her clothes hung loosely around her decaying frame. The others in the car began to transform too, each one turning into the same decayed, ghostly version of themselves, their eyes clouded, their skin falling apart in sickening patches. Panic surged through Alice. She backed away, trying to push through the crowd of passengers, but her body refused to move. It was as if the air had thickened, solidified into something impenetrable, holding her in place. The whispers of the spirits filled her ears, and she heard them clearly now, their voices a dissonant chorus. "You've awakened us, you've awakened the hunger." Alice's breath caught in her throat, her heart racing as she realized what was happening. The spirits weren't just haunting her, they were spreading, feeding off the sorrow, the grief, the fear that had gripped the city. The curse had reached a critical mass, and now it was consuming everything in its path, devouring the souls of the living, distorting them into twisted, decayed versions of their former selves. The train screeched to a halt, but the door didn't open. The passengers remained frozen in place, their bodies twitching and jerking in unnatural ways as if their spirits were trapped inside their decaying shells. The air was thick with a stench of death and decay, and Alice could feel the curse pressing against her chest, suffocating her, trying to pull her into the void with them. She struggled to breathe, her mind racing. The reality of what was happening began to sink in. The curse wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about the building or her family's bloodline. It was feeding off something more personal, something deep inside her. The grief that had been consuming her since the death of her sibling, the unresolved pain that she had carried with her for so long, was the source of this power. Her sorrow, her trauma, had become the vessel for the curse's strength. And now, that strength was feeding on the city itself. "It's you. It's all your fault." The voice of the ghostly woman echoed in her mind, the realization slamming into Alice like a wave. In a moment of clarity, Alice understood. The spirits had been feeding off her grief all along, drawing power from her unresolved emotions, from the hole left by her sibling's death, and now, with the curse growing stronger, it had reached its peak. It was no longer just a haunting. It was a force, a dark, insatiable power that was consuming everything around her, turning the city into a decaying, ghostly wasteland. She could hear the screams of the passengers now, their voices distorted and desperate, but their words were indistinguishable. Alice's stomach churned and her mind raced, scrambling for a solution, for a way to stop this. Her grief had made her vulnerable, had given the spirits the power they needed to spread, and now they were claiming more lives with each passing moment. The train lurched again and Alice fell to the floor, scrambling to her feet as the doors finally opened. She darted out of the car, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The station was a nightmare. The walls of the subway were covered in the same grotesque symbols she had seen in her apartment, the same markings that had been etched into the walls of the cursed building. The station was empty now, silent. The air was thick with malevolent energy. The spirits were everywhere, feeding off the grief and pain that lingered in the city's bones. Alice's hands shook, her mind reeling from the realization. She was the key to stopping the curse, but she was also its fuel. The path ahead seemed impossibly dark. How could she sever the connection between her grief and the curse? How could she free the city from the suffocating grip of the spirits? The clock was ticking. The more she allowed herself to succumb to her sorrow, the more the curse would feed off it. But could she even live without the grief that had defined her life? With no time to waste, Alice's only choice was to face the question head-on. Could she embrace her grief, confront it, and break free of the curse? Or would she be forced to carry it with her forever, feeding the spirits until they consumed everything? The weight of the city's sorrow pressed heavily against Alice as she descended the staircase in the abandoned building, the same one she had once called home. Each step felt like a beat of a forgotten heart, the walls around her groaning as if they were alive. The echoes of the past reverberated in the air, each shadow whispering the untold stories of the building, stories of betrayal, sacrifice, and unspeakable pain. She could feel the spirits all around her now, closing in, watching her, waiting. The room she entered seemed frozen in time, a macabre reproduction of her childhood memories, but distorted and darkened by the curse. The wallpaper was peeling, the air thick with dust, and the dim, flickering light of an old chandelier cast eerie shadows over everything. It was here, in this very place, that her mother had been murdered, where the ritual had been completed, where the curse had taken root. Alice had spent so many years trying to forget, but the ghosts of the past were unrelenting. The time had come for her to face them. She didn't know how she knew, but Alice could feel their presence. They were waiting for her. The ghostly couple, the ones who had been trapped here for decades, had summoned her. She stepped forward, heart pounding in her chest, the stifling air choking her breath. Then from the darkness they appeared. The woman, her mother, was standing there, her ghostly figure draped in a tattered white gown. Her skin was pale, translucent, her eyes empty pools of sorrow. Her face was contorted with grief, a mixture of anger and despair that Alice could see mirrored in her own heart. The man beside her, the murderer, was dressed in the attire of a bygone era, his face a grotesque mask of pain, his eyes hollow, yet filled with an insatiable hunger. Alice, the woman's voice broke through the stillness, hollow and sorrowful, yet tinged with something darker. You've returned. And now the cycle must be completed. The curse can end, but you must sacrifice yourself. Alice's throat tightened. Her mother's eyes pierced her soul, digging into her deepest fears and regrets. This was it. The truth she had repressed for so long. The woman who had raised her had been trapped in the cycle of this curse, and now she was demanding that Alice join her in the spirit world, to become part of the eternal ritual. Alice's mind raced. How could she end this? How could she free herself from this place, from her family's dark history, without giving in to this haunting demand? We can break the cycle, Alice, the man's voice rasped like the whisper of dead leaves. But you must replace her. Become part of the ritual. You will become the conduit, the link between the worlds. You will give your soul to us, and the curse will be undone. A cold shiver ran down Alice's spine as she felt the heavy weight of the decision before her. It was the only way out. But as her heart screamed to refuse, another thought surfaced, one that made her sick with dread. What if there's another way? Suddenly she heard it, a soft, whispering voice behind her. The very voice that had been there since the beginning. Victor. She turned, expecting to see him, but what she saw made her blood run cold. Victor wasn't standing as he had in the past. He was floating, his translucent form shimmering in the dim light. His eyes were dark, empty, and his mouth twisted into a wicked smile. The same wicked smile that had greeted her with false promises of salvation. Did you really think I was here to save you, Alice? He asked, his voice oozing with malice. I wasn't trying to stop the curse or protect you. I've been orchestrating this all along. Alice's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded in her chest as Victor's form solidified before her. He was no longer the compassionate artist she thought she knew. He was a ghost, twisted by his own selfish desire to possess her. You think you're the one who's trapped here? Victor continued, his voice low, each word a dagger. I was the one who helped curse this building, who bound us all to this place. And now you're the final piece of the puzzle, Alice. Once the ritual is completed, I'll take your body. I'll become the vessel, your soul will be mine. Forever. Shock rippled through Alice as the truth sank in. Victor had manipulated her, used her grief and her desire for answers to lure her into his trap. His warnings, his supposed redemption, they had all been lies. She had been nothing more than a pawn in his twisted game. The room seemed to close in around her as the spirits of the ghostly couple loomed closer, their presence pressing against her from all sides. The ritual was already beginning. The air thickened with an ancient power, swirling around Alice, drawing her in. The woman's pale hand reached for her, fingers cold and skeletal. "No," Alice whispered, recoiling. She couldn't do this. She couldn't let them take her. In that moment of clarity, Alice knew what she had to do. She didn't have to follow the ritual, didn't have to become a sacrifice or a vessel. She had the power to break the curse, to sever the cycle of death and pain that had haunted her family for generations. Alice closed her eyes, feeling the weight of everything. The ghosts, the curse, the pain of losing her sibling, the weight of her own grief. It was all part of her, part of what had brought her to this moment. But she wouldn't let it consume her. She wouldn't let the spirits win. Her eyes snapped open, fire in them now. The darkness that had once been her greatest fear was now her strength. "I won't be your pawn anymore," Alice said, her voice steady. "And I won't let you use my grief to feed your curse." With a sudden force, Alice thrust her hands forward, pushing against the oppressive energy that surrounded her. A pulse of light, raw and powerful, surged from her chest. It was a light fueled by everything she had faced, the sorrow, the pain, the love and the rage, and it broke the curse's hold. Victor screamed as the light enveloped him, his form flickering and twisting as it was consumed by the radiant force. The ghostly couple recoiled, their forms dissolving into mist as the curse unraveled around them. Alice fell to her knees, exhaustion flooding her. She had done it. She had broken the cycle. The curse was lifted and the spirits were freed. The building, her home, was silent once more. But as the light faded, Alice felt something still linger. The weight of her grief remained, but now, it was hers to carry. She had faced the darkness, confronted her past, and chosen to free herself from it. The curse was gone, but the journey ahead was hers to define. The once familiar skyline of New York City now appeared distorted, a warping, unsettling mirror of itself. The towering skyscrapers bent and twisted like spectral shadows, stretching unnaturally into the sky. Streets that had once been bustling with life were now eerily silent, filled with fog that seemed to pulse with a ghostly rhythm. Time itself had become fluid, the boundaries between the living world and the realm of the dead no longer clear. Alice stood at the edge of what was once the vibrant heart of the city, now reduced to a fractured landscape. It was as though she had crossed into another world, one where the laws of nature no longer applied. She could hear the faint echoes of voices in the air, the whispers of the dead brushing past her ears as if calling her name. The city's skyline flickered like a fading memory, and the once bustling streets seemed to stretch on endlessly into nothingness. It was a city caught between worlds, where the living and the dead existed side by side, trapped in an eternal loop. Her heart hammered in her chest. She had thought she had broken the curse. She had thought she had freed herself from the ghosts that had tormented her, but it was clear now that she had only unraveled one thread in an intricate web of supernatural power. The curse, fed by her grief, had taken root in the very fabric of the city, and now the city itself was falling apart, collapsing into a rift where the boundaries between the living and the dead were no longer just blurred, they had merged. The streets seemed to pulse beneath her feet, as if the city itself was alive, breathing, shifting. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the scent of both forgotten memories and unburied souls. Alice knew she couldn't stay here much longer. She had to escape, had to find a way to stop this madness before it consumed everything. But the spirits, their power now magnified by the ritual, had become the city's very essence. They hunted her from every corner, their hollow eyes fixed on her, their voices rising into an otherworldly chorus. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet cracked open, the rift spreading wider. Alice stumbled backward, gasping for air as the walls of the buildings around her melted away into the void. Shadows moved in the corners of her vision, twisted faces emerging from the darkness, each one a reflection of a ghost she had encountered in the past. The murdered woman, Victor, the cursed couple, even her own family, their forms distorted and unnatural. And then, amidst the chaos, a figure appeared before her. It was the ghostly woman, the one who had once been her mother. But now she was different. Her form flickered like a broken reflection, her features contorted with agony and rage. "Alice," the ghost called, her voice no longer a whisper but a shriek that echoed in every corner of the city. "You cannot escape. The city is ours now. You are bound to us just as your family has always been. You are part of the curse, part of the darkness. You will never be free." Alice's knees trembled, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The very air around her seemed to press in, suffocating her. The city's decay mirrored her own sense of impending doom. "What if I can't escape?" she thought. "What if this is my fate?" But as the spirits closed in, a strange calm settled over her. She had been running from her past for so long, from the curse that had haunted her family, from the pain that had consumed her. But now, standing in the heart of the rift, she realized the truth. She was the one who had created this. She had shattered the curse, yes, but in doing so, she had opened a door to a new realm, one where the dead would never rest, and where her family's legacy would continue to haunt the city for eternity. The ghostly woman stepped closer, her eyes filled with desperation. "You must choose," she said, her voice now softer, almost pleading. "You can join us in the underworld, end your suffering, and become part of the spirits. Or you can stay here in the living world and fight. But know this, the city will fall apart without you. You are the one who created this. You are the one who can either destroy it or keep it alive." The choice was impossible. Alice had faced so much darkness, so many terrifying truths, but now at the final moment she felt as though she were standing at the edge of an abyss, with no clear path forward. To join the dead was to surrender, to leave behind everything she had ever known. But to fight meant to preserve a world that was already on the brink of collapse. Either way, she would be tied to this place, to the curse, to her family's dark legacy. She closed her eyes, letting the weight of the decision sink in. Her mind raced through everything she had experienced, the pain, the grief, the ghosts that had tormented her, and yet, amid it all, one thought stood out: "I can't give in. I won't." When she opened her eyes again, the city around her seemed to shudder, the air thick with energy. Alice took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, the enormity of the choice before her. The spirits had been feeding off her grief, but she knew now that she could reclaim her power. She could choose to fight for the living world, to preserve the fragile peace that still remained. She would no longer be the victim of the curse. She would be its end. With trembling hands, she stepped forward into the rift, her heart pounding with a newfound strength. The world around her seemed to bend and twist as she reached out, her soul intertwining with the city's energy. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for the world, for the lives of the people still trapped within it. And then, in the final moment, everything went dark. When Alice opened her eyes again, the world was quiet. The rift was gone. The city had reset as though nothing had ever happened. The buildings stood tall and unbroken, the streets filled with the hum of life once more. The sky above was a soft, serene blue, and the air was calm. It was as if the horrors she had faced had all been a nightmare, a dream that had faded into the morning light. But something was wrong. She could still feel it, an undercurrent of something that wasn't quite right. She turned to look around, and there, standing in the distance, was a figure she knew all too well. Victor. But he was different now. His form shimmered, faint and intangible, as though he were part of the city itself, part of its very soul. And then Alice understood. She hadn't erased the curse. She hadn't destroyed it. She had created something new. The spirits had been freed, but in doing so, she had opened a door to a new plane of existence, one where the ghosts of the city could roam forever. And now she was the guardian of that realm. The city was no longer the city she had known. It was a city of ghosts, a city where the living and the dead would coexist forever, where the boundary between worlds had been forever altered. And Alice, standing at the edge of that reality, was the one who held the key. As the sun set over the city, she realized that she would never be the same. The curse was gone, but its legacy remained, and now she was its keeper. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when sunshine finally left the school building, her thoughts swirling with an unsettling heaviness. The day had started like any other, mundane, predictable, but there had been something off in the air all morning, a tension that settled in her chest and made her skin prickle. It wasn't until the strange events during her last class that she realized how wrong everything felt. The teacher, Miss Carmichael, had been speaking about historical events, but her voice had started to waver, as though she were reading from a page she couldn't quite remember. The chalk screeched across the board, an unsettling sound that vibrated through Sunshine's bones, sending a ripple of nausea through her. When she glanced up, she could have sworn Miss Carmichael's face momentarily morphed, her eyes widening, her skin paling, as if someone else had been wearing her face for a moment. The shift was so sudden that Sunshine blinked and it was gone, replaced by a sweet, calm smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Are you okay, Sunshine?" A voice snapped her back to the present. It was Heather, her best friend, standing beside her in the hallway as they both headed for the exit. Her voice was laced with concern, but Sunshine could see the uncertainty in Heather's eyes too. Sunshine nodded weakly, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had been growing in the pit of her stomach all day. "Just tired," she said, though even as the words left her lips, she didn't believe them. As she walked home, the familiar route down Main Street seemed altered, darker somehow, even though the sun hadn't fully set. Sunshine shook her head, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck rise. There was something in the air, something wrong. She paused at a corner near the old park, staring at the rusted swing set that creaked despite there being no wind. The eerie sound cut through the stillness, and as her gaze shifted toward the town's abandoned library, she noticed something odd. A small, weathered photograph laying on the pavement beneath a fallen tree branch. Curiosity got the better of her, and she approached it slowly, her heart beating faster with each step. The photograph was partially buried in the dirt, its edges curled with age. She bent down and picked it up, brushing off the dirt and grime, and that's when she saw it. A younger version of herself, barely 5 or 6 years old, her face alight with a joyful, carefree smile. But the surrounding figures in the photograph made Sunshine's breath catch in her throat. The people standing next to her were not family members as she would expect. They were strangers. And their faces were twisted, distorted, as if their expressions were pulled into unnatural grins, too wide, too malicious. Some had eyes that were too big, others had mouths stretched far too thin. All of them were looking at her, not with the warmth of family, but with an eerily knowing gaze, like they knew something about her, about the future, something she couldn't understand. Sunshine's stomach twisted. How could this be? She had no memory of this photo being taken. She had never seen those people before. Her fingers trembled as she turned the photograph over, expecting to find some clue, a name, a date, something. But the back was blank, completely clean. It was as though it had never existed at all, except that it was in her hands and it was hers. A chill swept through her, and she quickly stuffed the photograph into her jacket pocket, feeling like it weighed more than it should. She turned to leave, but the air around her seemed to hum with a low, unsettling vibration, like a heartbeat echoing too loudly in the distance. She spun around, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing there, but the street was empty. No one was around. Yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. By the time Sunshine reached her home, the sky had deepened into a twilight blue. The house, usually welcoming, now felt strangely cold. She walked inside, shrugging off her jacket and dropping her bag by the door. The house was unnervingly quiet. "Mom?" she called out, but there was no response. Sunshine walked through the house, growing more uneasy with each passing second. Her mother, always so attentive, usually greeted her after school, but today there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Sunshine's gaze landed on the kitchen, where she noticed her mother sitting at the table, a cup of tea in front of her. Her posture was rigid like a statue. "Mom?" Sunshine said again, stepping forward. Her mother didn't react. She stared blankly at the empty chair across from her, her hands resting stiffly on the table. For a moment, Sunshine thought her mother was simply lost in thought, but when she looked closer, she saw the unusual stillness in her eyes, the way her pupils didn't move, didn't blink. Sunshine's pulse quickened. "Mom?" she repeated, reaching out to touch her shoulder. Her mother's head snapped up, her expression instantly shifting into a soft, gentle smile. "Oh, Sunshine," she said, her voice smooth as though nothing had happened. "How was your day? You look tired." Sunshine froze, blinking rapidly. What was happening? Her mother had been so distant recently, so cold, almost like she was a different person. But now she was back to normal. Too normal. Too perfect. As if nothing had ever changed. Sunshine stepped back, a cold sweat forming on her brow. Her mother's eyes followed her, unblinking, a serene smile still pasted on her face. "Are you all right, sweetheart? You're acting strange." She wanted to scream. To ask her mother about the strange happenings, about the odd events at school, about the photograph she'd found, about why everything felt wrong. But as the words lingered on her lips, Sunshine hesitated. Her mother was right there, smiling at her, acting as if everything was fine. What if it was her own mind that was breaking? "Yeah, I'm fine," Sunshine whispered, forcing a smile she didn't feel. The photograph pressed heavily in her pocket, a constant reminder of the chilling reality she was now beginning to understand. But what was that reality? Was the curse already inside her? Had it been there all along, whispering, watching, shaping her life from the shadows? The questions churned inside her, the weight of the photograph growing heavier with every thought. She couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, she was at the center of something much darker than she could ever have imagined. But no matter how hard she tried to dismiss it, Sunshine knew one thing for sure. Her life was never going to be the same again. The days following the unsettling discovery of the photograph felt like a blur to Sunshine. Everything had gone back to a strange semblance of normalcy. Her mother was acting as if nothing had changed, as if there hadn't been an invisible shift in the atmosphere, like the world had somehow righted itself, despite the growing tension inside her. Sunshine couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something sinister was just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. It was just after midnight when it began. At first, it was faint, a whisper on the edge of her consciousness, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. She had woken up from another restless sleep, the kind where her mind never truly settled. Her body was exhausted, but her thoughts wouldn't let her rest. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, her mind swirling with the image of the photograph, the twisted faces that seemed to leer at her from the past. The quiet of the night should have been comforting, but instead, it felt like it was pressing in on her, suffocating her. The whisper came again, a voice that seemed to slide into her thoughts, not through her ears, but inside her mind, as if it had always been there, waiting. Sunshine. Her breath hitched, her body stiffening as the name echoed in the silence of her room. It was so soft yet unmistakable. She jerked upright, her eyes scanning the darkened room, the shadows stretching long across the walls. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling as she threw the blankets off her body, her feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. The voice was no longer a whisper but a low, almost soothing hum vibrating through her bones. "I am the old one," the voice murmured, and a shiver crawled up her spine. It wasn't a voice like any other, there was something ancient about it, a depth that seemed to stretch across centuries. "You have heard of me before, Sunshine. I have been here watching, waiting." Sunshine's heart began to race. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, taking a step toward the edge of the bed, her breath shallow, her mind reeling. "Who are you?" The voice seemed to respond to her question with an almost amused tone, as if the answer were something so obvious it didn't need to be spoken aloud. "I am the old one, and I have been here long before you." The words struck her like a physical blow, a knot forming in her stomach. "What do you mean? What are you talking about? How have I heard of you before?" Her voice shook, but there was no turning back now, she needed answers. "You have always been a part of this town, Sunshine. You have always been a part of the family." The voice softened as it spoke those final words, a subtle change in tone that chilled her to the core. "Join us, Sunshine. Join your family." The words echoed in her head, and she felt the weight of them like a dark promise. The old one's presence was all around her now, pressing in on her from every corner of the room. "The family has waited so long," the voice continued, "and now you will complete what has been started." Sunshine's heart thudded painfully in her chest, the weight of the words almost too much to bear. Her hand instinctively went to her throat, as if trying to quiet the rising panic that threatened to overtake her. "What does that mean? What do you want from me?" But the voice was gone, leaving only a haunting silence in its wake. The room was still, and Sunshine stood frozen at the edge of her bed, her body trembling uncontrollably. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet felt like they were rooted to the floor, her mind reeling from the enormity of what had just happened. With a shaky breath, she stumbled back into her bed, pulling the covers around her like a shield. She closed her eyes tightly, hoping that when she opened them again, it would all be gone, that it was just a figment of her imagination, a nightmare brought on by the stress and fear that had been consuming her. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. It was a few hours later, when the first light of dawn began to filter through her curtains, that the dreams started. At first, they were nothing more than fleeting images, strange and fragmented, but they quickly turned into something far more disturbing. In the dream, she was lying in a small, cramped space, the air thick and suffocating. She struggled to move, but the weight on top of her was unbearable. She was trapped, her hands clawing at the sides of a wooden box, the smell of damp earth filling her nostrils as she desperately gasped for air. The world above her was silent, save for the faint sound of the dirt shifting and falling, burying her further. Her breath quickened, panic rising in her chest as she tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. "Help!" she cried, her voice muffled by the wood, but there was no response. The air around her grew thick, and the edges of her vision started to blur, her limbs growing weaker with each passing moment. And then, just as the darkness seemed to close in completely, her eyes snapped open. Sunshine shot up from her bed, gasping for breath, her heart hammering in her chest. The room was bathed in early morning light, and for a brief, fleeting moment she thought the nightmare was over. But something was wrong. She looked down at her hands and dirt was caked under her nails, the unmistakable smell of earth still lingering in the air. She wasn't in her bed anymore, she was lying in the same position she had been in during her dream, and the ground beneath her felt solid, too real. She was buried. Her body jerked with terror as the memories of the dream crashed over her like waves. The coffin. The suffocating darkness. The air thick with the smell of damp earth. She clawed at the sheets, her heart racing as she tried to sit up, to get away from the nightmare that felt all too real. But then the truth hit her. Sunshine wasn't dreaming. She had been buried, in the cemetery beneath the weight of the earth. And she had somehow made her way back to her bed, covered in dirt. The panic surged in her chest once again. Had it been a vision? A warning? Or was the voice in her head, the one that claimed to be the old one, manipulating her mind? Was it trying to show her what had already been decided for her, what was inevitably going to happen? Was the town pulling her closer, wrapping its dark tendrils around her, forcing her to take her place in its horrifying cycle? She stumbled out of bed, her legs weak as she touched her forehead, feeling the dampness of sweat. She needed to get out of there. She had to understand what was happening. The whisper of the old one still echoed in her mind, as if it were waiting for her to join the family, to take the final step toward whatever fate awaited her. The line between reality and nightmare was growing thinner with every passing second. Sunshine wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. But she knew one thing for sure now, whatever was happening to her, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. The night sky hung heavy, thick with the scent of rain, as the townsfolk gathered beneath the looming shadow of the blood moon. It bathed the town in a sickly crimson hue, casting an otherworldly light on the crumbling streets, making everything feel unreal, like the world itself was teetering on the edge of some unspeakable horror. Sunshine stood at the edge of the town square, her mind racing. She had to stop this. She had to break free, even if it meant confronting the very thing that had haunted her since the moment she'd first heard the whispers in her head. The old one. Pastor Jacobs had warned her, "You don't have a choice. None of us do." But she couldn't accept it. She couldn't accept that this was her fate, that she was destined to join the twisted ranks of the Sunshine Girls, the living sacrifices who kept the curse alive. The town had to be stopped. There had to be a way to end the cycle. With trembling hands, Sunshine stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the ritual drawing closer, feel the eyes of the townsfolk watching her, waiting for her to make her move. The crowd, a mass of shadowed faces under the sickly light of the blood moon, parted before her as if in reverence, but she didn't hesitate. She would confront them all. She would confront the curse itself. Just as she took another step, ready to shout, ready to expose the truth, the air around her seemed to shift. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, like the earth itself was trembling. Her vision blurred and the world began to distort. The familiar streets of the town morphed, bending at impossible angles. A sudden pulling sensation took hold of her, a force stronger than anything she had ever felt before. Her body stiffened, and before she could react, she was yanked violently from the familiar world, as though the very fabric of reality had torn open and swallowed her whole. Her head spun, her breath caught in her throat. The world around her warped, darkness consumed the edges of her vision, like she was falling into an endless void. The sensations were overwhelming, each one more suffocating than the last. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Sunshine stumbled to her knees, gasping for breath. She looked around, trying to comprehend what had happened. Her mind screamed for an explanation, but none came. She was standing in the town square once again, but it was wrong. It was reversed. The streets were still cobblestone, but they seemed cracked, like they had been hastily rebuilt. The sky above was still red with the blood moon, but it was more intense here, as if it was pressing down, suffocating everything. And the people, the townsfolk, were here too, but they were different. They weren't the hollow-eyed, broken figures she had seen in the real world. No, these were the same people, but they were alive, too alive, twisted into something unnatural. Their faces were painted with dark, vacant smiles, and their eyes gleamed with malicious intent. The life was gone from their eyes, What remained was pure, unfathomable darkness. They moved with purpose, walking with a kind of ritualistic grace, as if they were all part of a preordained performance. Her heart raced as she stood up, her mind desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But as her feet echoed against the cobblestones, she felt the chilling pull of familiarity. The people here were, she couldn't believe it, alive but corrupted. They were part of this twisted reflection, part of the cycle, like echoes from the real world. Then she saw her. In the center of it all, standing on the steps of a building she didn't recognize, was her mother. But this wasn't the mother she had known, the one who had been cold and distant, the one who had seemed so broken. No, this version of her mother was different, twisted, cruel, and powerful. She stood with an air of command, her face framed by the red glow of the blood moon. The clothes she wore were ceremonial, black and flowing, adorned with symbols Sunshine didn't recognize. And then her mother spoke. "The time has come, Sunshine. You have always been part of this." Sunshine froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes flicked to the people surrounding her mother. They were all staring at her now, their smiles widening with anticipation. Her stomach twisted, nausea rising as the words settled in. Her mother was the one leading the rituals. The realization was too much to bear. Her mother had known all along. She had always been part of this twisted cycle, playing a role she had accepted without question. And now Sunshine was to play her part. The blood moon above seemed to pulse, its light growing brighter with each passing second, and the townsfolk began to chant in low voices, their words unintelligible but somehow familiar. Sunshine could feel their eyes upon her, could feel the weight of their gaze. It wasn't just the townsfolk she had to worry about, it was the curse itself, watching, waiting for her next move. Before she could comprehend what was happening, her mother's voice rang out again, cold and commanding. "It's too late, Sunshine. You can't escape it. The curse lives on through you. You are the next incarnation, the next Sunshine Girl." Her world tilted. A wave of dizziness crashed over her, and for the briefest moment, the town and its twisted inhabitants began to fade. Her mind flashed to the ritual, to the endless cycle of death and rebirth that had been woven into the fabric of this place. She could no longer deny it. She had been chosen from the beginning, just like Isabella, just like the others before her. The cycle couldn't be broken. No matter how many sacrifices were made, curse would always find a new vessel. Each Sunshine Girl was just another piece in the puzzle, a puzzle that could never be completed. The mirror version of the town began to fade, dissolving into darkness, but not before Sunshine caught a glimpse of her reflection. She was no longer just herself. She was an embodiment of the town's curse, its inevitable next Sunshine Girl. She was trapped. When the world around her snapped back into focus, Sunshine was standing alone in the square once more, the townsfolk gone. But she knew the truth now, the curse was not something that could be escaped. It was part of her. She was part of it. The blood moon had finally descended beneath the horizon, casting an eerie shadow over the entire town. Sunshine could feel the pulse of the curse now, like an unholy heartbeat syncing with her own. There was no escaping it. No matter how hard she fought, no matter how many times she ran, it always found her, pulling her deeper into its twisted grip. She found herself standing at the center of the ritual circle in the town square, unable to move, frozen. It felt as if her body had been paralyzed by an unseen force, every nerve in her body screaming for release, but she could only stand there, motionless, as the moonlight flickered with unnatural intensity. She was caught, suspended in time. And as the world around her began to blur and twist, she could feel the very fabric of the curse wrapping tighter and tighter around her. Suddenly, everything changed. Her vision shifted violently, and she was no longer in the square. She was thrust into a nightmarish flood of memories, every single death in the town's history. She was drowning in them. The screams, the pleading, the terror, they were all around her, suffocating her. Faces she didn't recognize but who felt familiar. People she had never seen before, their eyes wide with panic, their faces twisted in unimaginable pain as they were consumed by whatever evil had haunted this town for centuries. The chilling whispers of those who had fallen, those who had been sacrificed, echoed in her ears, the voices blending into a chorus of despair. Sunshine couldn't look away. She was trapped in this vision, unable to close her eyes, to block it out. The pain, the agony, of the deaths she had never witnessed but now felt as though they were her own, pierced her soul. She saw Isabella, the Sunshine Girl before her wide, terrified eyes staring into the same cursed future Sunshine was being drawn into. Isabella's death, it became clear, wasn't just an isolated incident. It was the beginning of a never-ending cycle, a cycle that wasn't about one girl being chosen. It was about all of them, bound together in a twisted fate they couldn't escape. Sunshine felt the desperation, the overwhelming madness that had overtaken Isabella's mind before her death, a realization that she too was being manipulated by a force far greater than herself. "We never had a choice," Isabella's voice echoed through the madness, her words now a whisper inside Sunshine's head. Sunshine's body trembled in the paralyzing grip of the curse, but it was not just the fear she felt now, it was a deeper understanding. The entities controlling the town weren't simply after her, they were using everyone. The townsfolk, the previous Sunshine Girls, even those who had never been part of the cursed cycle. They were all puppets, their lives woven into the dark plans of an insidious force. It wasn't just a curse, it was a conspiracy centuries in the making, involving every soul that had lived here. The deaths weren't mistakes. They were necessary sacrifices to feed the hunger of the entity at the heart of the town. Sunshine's blood ran cold as she realized that every death, every broken soul, had been part of this unholy cycle. But there was no time to dwell on that realization. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps and her vision began to narrow. A sudden force yanked her back from the vision, as if the town itself had spat her out. She was standing in a completely different place now. The air was thick with dampness. She was no longer in the town square but somewhere far darker, somewhere deeper. The stone beneath her feet was slick with moss and age, and the low hum of silence stretched out around her. She was in the crypt beneath the town, the place where the town's darkest secrets had been buried for centuries. Sunshine's heart raced. This was where the curse began. Her hands brushed along the walls of the crypt, where the stones were cracked and ancient. The atmosphere here was heavy, suffocating. Each step she took felt like a journey deeper into darkness. And then she saw it, the symbol carved into the wall. It was a grotesque design, dark and twisted, resembling the shape of a circle, but with lines that were jagged and sharp. It was the same symbol she had seen in the diary, the same one her mother had worn, the mark of the Sunshine Girls. The town had been built on this crypt, on this sacred, cursed ground. Sunshine's mind reeled as she finally understood the truth. The curse had never been an isolated occurrence. The town itself had been built on top of ancient burial grounds, grounds where rituals had been performed for centuries, long before the modern town was established. It wasn't just a curse born of a single, mysterious incident. It was woven into the very bones of the town, an ancient evil that had fed off the fear and pain of every resident for generations. The entity was not a god. It was something far darker, an embodiment of the town's desires, its darkest impulses. It had never cared about the people. It had cared only about feeding off their suffering, their deaths, and their fear. Every generation had given up one of its own, and in return, the town flourished. Prosperity at a cost, a price that no one could pay forever. Sunshine felt a horrible understanding settle in her gut. The death of the Sunshine Girls, the death of Isabella, wasn't just a byproduct of the curse. It was how the entity renewed its power, how it fed. The blood, the sacrifice, the terror, they were all part of the same unending cycle. And as the truth settled in her chest, Sunshine felt the sharp sting of her own impending fate. The next step in the cycle. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light in the crypt, she saw it. An altar, bathed in the same unnatural light as the moon, waiting for her. It was all too clear now. The end of the circle was drawing near. She was the next Sunshine Girl, and it was her blood that would renew the cycle, as it always had. She had been born for this. The entity had always known she would be part of this. She had no way to escape, no way out. The darkness crept closer. The whispering voices filled her ears again. "You're already ours." Sunshine stood frozen, surrounded by the oppressive weight of centuries of sacrifice. There was no escape. Not for her, and not for anyone who had ever walked this cursed town. And then she heard it, a sound that froze her in place, a low, guttural laugh that came from the very walls themselves. It was the voice of the entity, the old one, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 7. The Sacrifice. The blood moon hung ominously in the sky, casting its sickly red glow over the town. The air felt thick as if the earth itself was holding its breath. A cold, unnatural breeze swept through the town square, rustling the leaves of the long-forgotten trees that lined the streets. Sunshine stood at the center of the ritual circle, her hands bound by cold, iron chains. She could feel the weight of the curse pressing against her chest, each beat of her heart in sync with the dark pulse of the entity that had trapped her in this never-ending nightmare. The townspeople had gathered around her, their faces gaunt and pale, their eyes hollow with despair. They stood as silent witnesses, their expressions pleading, desperate for release. Her mother, once so distant and cold, stood at the front of the crowd, her gaze fixed on Sunshine with an unsettling intensity. It was as if she was both relieved and terrified of what was about to unfold. Pastor Jacob stood at the head of the ritual circle, his eyes gleaming with dark excitement, holding the ancient tome that had guided the town's evil for centuries. His voice echoed through the night air, reciting the incantations that would bring the curse to its culmination. But as he spoke, there was something different, something darker in the air. Sunshine's breath caught in her throat, and a strange pressure pressed against her mind, like an invisible force was trying to break through her thoughts. And then it came. The voice. The old one. It filled her mind, like a whisper at the edge of her consciousness, cold and ancient. The town itself seemed to shudder in response, as if it were alive, awakening to its final purpose. Sunshine. The voice echoed through her very being, each syllable sending a jolt of icy terror through her. You stand at the crossroads. You child of the sun, the last of your bloodline. The choice is yours. Her heart pounded, her chest tightening. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. There was no turning back now. The old one continued, its voice dripping with an eerie calm. You can end this cycle. End the curse. Sacrifice yourself and this town will be freed. Your people will know peace. Your mother will know peace. The cycle will end with you. Sunshine's eyes darted to her mother, standing among the crowd, her face twisted with a mixture of fear and longing. The townspeople stood motionless, their eyes fixed on her, waiting for her to make the impossible choice. Her mother's lips moved, though the words were barely audible over the wind. Please, save us, Sunshine. Make it end. The words cut deep. They were both a plea and an accusation. Her mother, the woman who had been so distant, now showed a level of vulnerability Sunshine had never seen before. The people around her, the ones she had once called friends, were also waiting for her decision. Mark's death, her only remaining connection to the world she once knew, had left a hollow ache in her heart. And now, this was her final choice, to sacrifice herself to end the horror that had haunted her for so long, or to give herself over to the entity and spare those she still loved. Or, the voice whispered, you can choose another path. Join me, Sunshine. Take my offer. You can save them all. Let me take your body and in return I will spare your loved ones. They will know peace and they will live. But you will become part of me, part of my eternal power. Sunshine felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her. Her hands trembled, the chains biting into her skin, but it wasn't just the physical pain that hurt. It was the unbearable, suffocating responsibility that she felt. Her choice was the only one that could either save or doom them all. She looked at her mother again, eyes searching for any sign of hope, any reason to trust the words of the entity. Her mother's expression wavered, the hope in her eyes almost too much to bear. But then, in the depths of her heart, Sunshine understood. The curse was never going to end. Her heart sank. This was no offer. The entity was playing with her, making her believe she had control when in reality she was just a pawn. It had been using her, manipulating her from the start, and now it was playing out the final act. Sunshine closed her eyes. Her decision was made. I will sacrifice myself. The moment the words left her lips, the ground beneath her feet trembled. The air thickened, vibrating with an unseen power. The townspeople's cries filled the air, but it was too late. As she stepped forward, preparing to give herself to the entity, she felt a rush of coldness surge through her. Her mind was flooded with visions, dark images of pain and death, of every sacrifice that had ever occurred in the town. It was not her body that the entity wanted, it was her soul. In the split second before the ritual could fully unfold, Sunshine's mind cleared and she realized the truth. She had made a terrible mistake. The entity had never intended to keep its word. It had never planned to spare anyone. It had simply used her sacrifice to grow stronger, to consume them all. Her body lurched forward, her breath catching in her throat as a wave of searing pain shot through her. She could feel herself being torn apart, the energy of the curse flowing through her, twisting and contorting her very essence. And then, in a heart-stopping moment of clarity, she saw it. The town, the people she had loved, and even her mother, they were not being spared. They were all being consumed. The ritual had not been about saving them. It had been about devouring them all. The entity had used her sacrifice to gain even more power, swallowing every soul in its wake. The agony of the townspeople filled the air as their cries echoed through the square, merging with the sounds of the cursed entity's growing strength. Sunshine screamed in horror as her body was pulled into the abyss of the curse. She had been its final piece, the missing link in the cycle that would never end. The twisted force of the entity surged through her, and in that moment, her understanding of the truth shattered. There was no escape. There never had been. The blood moon burned brighter as the final souls of the town were devoured, and the entity claimed its victory. The town was silent. The blood moon hung low, its red glow casting an unnatural hue over the streets. The ritual was complete. Sunshine had given herself willingly, sacrificing everything in an attempt to end the curse. Yet, as the final incantations were spoken and the townspeople stood motionless, waiting for the resolution they'd longed for, the world around her began to twist. Sunshine's breath faltered. Her vision blurred and the world seemed to dissolve. She felt her body go numb, her limbs heavy as if they no longer belonged to her. And then everything went dark. When Sunshine opened her eyes, it wasn't the peaceful darkness of death that greeted her. Instead, she found herself in a strange in-between place, cold, hollow, and warped. The edges of her vision were smudged, the world around her stretching like a dark, twisted shadow. She tried to move, but her body felt different, disconnected. It was as if her physical form was no longer her own. Her limbs were heavy and slow, shifting unnaturally, and her heart, if it still beat, felt distant, foreign. Then the darkness parted, revealing a horrific sight. The previous Sunshine Girls, dozens of them, stood before her, each of their faces frozen in a grotesque, eternal smile. They walked in eerie unison, their eyes hollow, their movements stiff and mechanical, like marionettes controlled by some unseen force. They were no longer human, not fully. Their bodies had been consumed, twisted by the entity's power into empty shells, nothing more than vessels of the curse. Sunshine tried to scream, but the sound that escaped her mouth was hollow, devoid of emotion. She saw herself among them, her reflection a ghastly distortion of her once lively self. Her eyes were no longer her own. They were empty, filled with a dark, swirling void. As she looked around, her gaze fell upon the familiar streets of the town. The streets she once knew so well. But now they were warped, distorted, and dead. The town was as much a part of the curse as the girls. Every corner, every building, every piece of the landscape pulsed with the malignant energy of the entity. She reached for her mother, but her hand passed through her like a phantom. Her mother was there too, a husk walking with the others. Her face was frozen in that same sickly smile, her eyes devoid of recognition. Sunshine's mother too, was now part of the curse, her soul lost forever to the old one. Then the voice came. Low, rumbling like the growl of something ancient and powerful. Welcome home, Sunshine. It was the entity, its power far more tangible now. It wasn't just a force, it was a presence, a being that had fed off the fear, pain, and terror of the townspeople for centuries. It was the foundation of the town, the very thing that had kept it alive, feeding off its own dark desires. Sunshine's sacrifice hadn't ended it, it had solidified her place within it. You were always meant to be one of us, child. The voice was both soothing and suffocating. You are not just a part of this town's history but of something greater. The curse that once bound you now binds the world. Sunshine's mind swirled with understanding, horrible, overwhelming understanding. The curse was never meant to end. It was meant to grow, to spread beyond the borders of the town, beyond the very town itself. The entity's true intention had never been to break the cycle. It was using the Sunshine Girls to spread its malevolent influence to the outside world, to other towns, cities, and countries. She now realized, the curse had always been about control. Each Sunshine Girl was merely a vessel, a body meant to carry the entity's darkness beyond the confines of the town. Every Sunshine Girl who had died had been a key to unlocking the entity's true power. Now, Sunshine was not just a victim of the curse, she had become its servant, its vessel, its new force of terror. The sky above the town darkened, the red moon growing brighter, casting everything in an ominous glow. Sunshine felt the shift within her, a horrible alien presence that now claimed her as one of its own. She was no longer human, no longer a girl who had once laughed under the sun's warmth. Now she was something else, something darker. The entity, now fully awake and powerful, whispered its final command. Go, Sunshine. Spread the curse. Let the world know what true terror is. Sunshine felt herself move, her body no longer of her own accord, but under the influence of the entity. She stepped forward, her feet moving across the streets as though on autopilot. As she moved, the others, the previous Sunshine Girls, followed her, their hollow smiles never fading. The streets that had once felt like home were now unfamiliar, transformed into the entity's domain. Sunshine crossed the town limits, and the shadow of the curse stretched beyond the town, reaching out like a dark hand, eager to wrap itself around the world. The air grew thick with darkness, a weight pressing on everything around her. As she moved further from the town, the curse began to take root. Cities far away, unaware of the ancient evil lying dormant in the small town, suddenly felt a chill. Dark winds began to stir, carrying with them whispers of fear and despair. Sunshine's footsteps were not just the steps of one girl, they were the first steps of a new age of darkness. The world was about to learn what it meant to be truly afraid. And as Sunshine looked back at the town, now distant but never forgotten, she smiled. Not out of joy, not out of sorrow, but because in that moment she understood. The curse would never end. The entity would always find new vessels, new Sunshine girls, who would carry the darkness to the ends of the earth. And with that, the cycle began anew. With Eleanor Ellie Carter, a 28-year-old struggling artist, sitting in her cluttered, dimly lit apartment. The space is a reflection of her life, chaotic, unfinished, and weighed down by failure. Her paintings, once vibrant and full of promise, now sit half-finished on easels, their colors muted and somber. Ellie's financial struggles have left her desperate, and her relationships have frayed under the weight of her self-doubt. On a dreary afternoon, Ellie receives a letter from a law firm in Vermont. The envelope is thick and yellowed, the ink on the address slightly smudged as if it had traveled through time to reach her. Inside, she finds a formal notice informing her that she has inherited Maplewood Mansion, a sprawling estate in rural Vermont, from her late aunt Margaret Maggie Carter, a distant relative she barely remembers. The letter is accompanied by a photograph of the mansion, a towering, Gothic structure with ivy-clad walls, broken windows, and an air of foreboding. The image sends a shiver down Ellie's spine, though she can't explain why. The lawyer's note urges her to visit the mansion as soon as possible to settle the estate. Ellie packs her few belongings into her aging car and sets off for Vermont. The drive is long and lonely, the landscape shifting from bustling towns to desolate countryside. As she nears Maplewood, the environment grows increasingly eerie, lush forests give way to gnarled, leafless trees, and the sky darkens as if perpetually overcast. She stops in the nearby town, Black Hollow, to ask for directions. The townsfolk are wary and reluctant to speak about the mansion. An elderly woman, Agatha Pryor, warns Ellie to stay away, muttering, "No good ever came from that place." When Ellie presses for details, Agatha simply shakes her head and walks away, leaving Ellie with a growing sense of unease. Ellie arrives at the mansion as the sun sets, casting long shadows across the overgrown grounds. The mansion looms before her, its windows like hollow eyes staring into her soul. The air is thick with the scent of decay, and the only sound is the rustling of leaves in the wind. As she steps inside, the door creaks shut behind her, and she's enveloped in silence. The interior is a time capsule of faded grandeur, dust-covered furniture, peeling wallpaper, and a grand staircase leading to the upper floors. Ellie feels a strange sense of familiarity, as if she's been here before, though she knows she hasn't. Ellie begins to unpack her belongings in one of the less dusty bedrooms. As she opens her suitcase, she finds a small, intricately carved wooden box she doesn't recognize. The box is cold to the touch, and its surface is covered in strange, swirling patterns that seem to shift when she looks at them. Inside the box is a locket, its silver chain tarnished with age. When Ellie opens it, she finds a photograph of herself as a child, despite her never having visited the mansion before. The locket begins to hum faintly, and the murmurs she heard earlier grow louder, more insistent. She quickly closes the locket and sets it aside, her hands trembling. Ellie decides to spend the night in the mansion, despite her growing unease. She chooses a small bedroom on the second floor, its furniture draped in white sheets. As she settles in, she hears faint murmurs, indistinct whispers that seem to come from the walls themselves. She dismisses it as her imagination, but the murmurs grow louder, more insistent. Unable to sleep, Ellie explores the mansion by flashlight. She finds a locked door with strange symbols carved into the wood. When she touches it, the murmurs stop abruptly and she hears a child's voice whisper, "Don't let them in." Startled, she backs away and returns to her room, where she spends the rest of the night clutching a knife, her heart pounding. That night, Ellie has a vivid dream. She sees a child, a girl in a tattered dress, leading her through the mansion to the locked room. The child turns to her and says, "You've always been here." Ellie wakes up in a cold sweat, her heart racing. As she catches her breath, she notices muddy footprints on the floor, leading from her bed to the locked room. The footprints are small, as if made by a child. Ellie follows them, her flashlight flickering, but they disappear just before reaching the door. Ellie stumbles back to her room, her mind racing. She glances out the window and sees the mansion's windows glowing faintly, as if lit from within. The murmurs return, louder this time, and she realizes they're saying her name. She runs to her car, determined to leave, but as she drives away, she glances in the rearview mirror and sees the mansion's windows still glowing, the child's face pressed against one of them, watching her go. Ellie waking up in the mansion, the pale morning light filtering through the cracked windows. The events of the previous night, the murmurs, the child's voice, the muddy footprints, linger in her mind like a bad dream. She tries to shake off the unease, telling herself it was just her imagination, but the memory of the glowing windows and the child's face in the rearview mirror haunts her. As she explores the mansion in daylight, she notices details she missed before. Strange symbols carved into the door frames, faint scratches on the walls, and a pervasive sense of being watched. The murmurs are quieter now, but they're still there, a constant undercurrent of sound that makes her skin crawl. Ellie decides to search the mansion for clues about her aunt and the strange occurrences. In the attic, she finds a dusty trunk filled with old belongings, photographs, letters, and a leather-bound journal belonging to her aunt, Margaret Maggie Carter. The journal's early entries are mundane, detailing Maggie's daily life and her efforts to restore the mansion. But as Ellie reads further, the tone shifts. Maggie writes about hearing whispers in the walls, seeing shadowy figures in the corners of her vision, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Midway through the journal, Ellie notices something strange. The handwriting changes, becoming her own. The entries describe events that haven't happened yet, including her own death. One entry reads, "I tried to leave, but the mansion won't let me go. It's too late for me, but maybe not for you. Be careful, Ellie. He's watching." As Ellie closes the journal, she hears a voice calling her name from the basement. The voice is faint but unmistakable, it's her own. Her heart pounds as she follows the sound, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The basement is damp and cold, the air thick with the smell of mildew. In the corner, she finds a large mirror covered in a dusty sheet. The voice grows louder as she approaches, and she hesitates, her hand trembling as she reaches for the sheet. Ellie pulls the sheet off the mirror, revealing a tarnished, ornate frame. Her reflection stares back at her, but something is off. The reflection's expression is cold and calculating, unlike her own. Before she can react, her reflection steps out of the mirror, its movements fluid and unnatural. It whispers, "You don't belong here," its voice echoing in the confined space. Ellie stumbles back, her flashlight falling to the floor and rolling away, plunging the room into darkness. When she fumbles for the flashlight and turns it back on, the reflection is gone, and the mirror is cracked as if struck by a powerful force. The murmurs return, louder and more urgent, and Ellie flees the basement, her heart racing. Ellie returns to the locked room she discovered the previous night. The symbols on the door seem to pulse faintly in the dim light, and the murmurs grow louder as she approaches. She tries the door again, but it's still locked. As she presses her ear to the door, she hears faint scratching sounds, like nails dragging across wood. A child's voice whispers, "Let me out," sending a chill down her spine. Ellie backs away, her mind racing with questions. Who, or what, is locked in the room? And why does it sound like a child? Ellie retreats to her room, her mind reeling from the day's events. As she sits on the edge of the bed, she catches a glimpse of her reflection in the window. The reflection's expression is cold and distant, and it mouths the words, "You don't belong here." Ellie turns away, her hands trembling, and the murmurs grow louder, filling the room with their insistent whispers. She covers her ears, but the voices are inside her head now, a cacophony of fear and despair. Ellie driving to the nearby town of Black Hollow to research the history of Maplewood Mansion. The town is quiet and somber, its streets lined with weathered buildings and wary residents. Ellie feels their eyes on her as she walks to the town library, a crumbling brick building with a faded sign that reads Black Hollow Historical Society. Inside, the library is dimly lit and filled with the scent of old paper and dust. The librarian, Thomas "Tom" Grayson, is a middle-aged man with a kind but cautious demeanor. When Ellie mentions Maplewood Mansion, his expression darkens, and he reluctantly agrees to help her. Tom leads Ellie to a secluded section of the library, where old records and artifacts are stored. Among the dusty shelves, Ellie notices a peculiar door with a rusted handle. Tom hesitates, warning her that some things are better left buried, but Ellie insists. Inside the hidden room, the air is thick with the smell of mildew. The walls are lined with old books, yellowed newspapers, and faded photographs. In the center of the room hangs a large portrait of Dr. Alastair Maplewood, the mansion's original owner. The portrait is eerily lifelike, with piercing eyes that seem to follow Ellie as she moves. As she examines the portrait, she hears a faint whisper, "Welcome home, Eleanor." Startled, she turns to Tom, but he doesn't seem to have heard anything. When she looks back at the portrait, the eyes are no longer following her, but the sense of being watched remains. Ellie and Tom spend hours poring over old records and newspapers. They uncover the story of Dr. Alastair Maplewood, a reclusive 19th-century occultist who built the mansion as a sanctuary for his experiments. According to the records, Dr. Maplewood was obsessed with communicating with the dead and conducted rituals to open a gateway to the other side. The experiments went awry, and the mansion became a place of tragedy. Several people disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and Dr. Maplewood himself vanished without a trace. The townsfolk believed the mansion was cursed, and it was abandoned for decades until Ellie's aunt, Maggie, inherited it. As Ellie continues her research, she finds a letter addressed to her, tucked inside an old book. The letter is from her aunt, Maggie, but the postmark is dated after Maggie's death. The handwriting is shaky, as if written in a hurry, and the message is chilling. "Ellie, if you're reading this, it means you've inherited the mansion. I tried to warn you, but it's too late now. The ritual is a trap. He's waiting for you. Don't trust the whispers. Don't trust the reflections. And whatever you do, don't let him in." Ellie's hands tremble as she reads the letter. She shows it to Tom, who grows visibly uneasy. He admits that Maggie had come to him for help before her death, but he couldn't make sense of her ramblings. Ellie returns to the mansion, her mind racing with questions. As she steps inside, the murmurs grow louder, and she feels a cold draft, as if the mansion itself is breathing. She decides to search the mansion for more clues, starting with the locked room. When she reaches the locked door, the symbols carved into the wood seem to glow faintly. She hears the child's voice again, whispering, "Let me out." This time, the voice is accompanied by faint scratching sounds, as if something is trying to escape. Ellie retreats to her room, her mind reeling from the day's discoveries. As she sits on the edge of the bed, she catches a glimpse of her reflection in the window. The reflection's expression is cold and distant, and it mouths the words, "He's waiting for you." Ellie turns away, her hands trembling, and the murmurs grow louder, filling the room with their insistent whispers. She covers her ears, but the voices are inside her head now, a cacophony of fear and despair. Ellie in the mansion's dimly lit study, surrounded by candles, old books, and the items she's gathered for the ritual. A silver dagger, a vial of her own blood, and a lock of her hair. The journal lies open on the desk, its pages filled with cryptic instructions and warnings. Ellie's hands tremble as she arranges the items in a circle, her mind racing with doubt. The murmurs are louder than ever, a constant, insistent whisper that makes it hard to concentrate. She glances at the locked door across the room, the symbols carved into it glowing faintly in the candlelight. Ellie begins the ritual, reciting the incantation from the journal. The candles flicker, and the air grows heavy, as if the room itself is holding its breath. The murmurs grow louder, blending into a cacophony of voices that seem to come from all directions. As she pricks her finger and adds a drop of blood to the circle, the symbols on the locked door begin to glow brighter. The child's voice from her dream whispers, "You're making a mistake," but Ellie pushes forward, determined to silence the murmurs once and for all. Just as Ellie reaches the climax of the ritual, the power goes out, plunging the room into darkness. The candles extinguish, and the murmurs stop abruptly, leaving an eerie silence. Ellie fumbles for her flashlight, her heart pounding. When the lights flicker back on, the ritual circle is broken, and the items are scattered across the floor. The symbols on the locked door are now dark, and the air feels colder, heavier. Ellie hears a faint giggle, and her blood runs cold. Ellie turns to see the child from her dreams standing in the corner of the room. The child's tattered dress is stained with dirt, and her eyes are hollow, filled with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. The child smiles, revealing teeth that are too sharp, too many. "You can't stop him," the child says, her voice a chilling blend of innocence and malice. "He's already inside you." Ellie stumbles back, her mind reeling. The child steps forward, her movements unnaturally fluid, and the murmurs return, louder and more urgent than ever. As the child advances, Ellie's mind floods with fragmented memories, images of the mansion, her aunt, and the locked room. She realizes the ritual was never meant to silence the murmurs. It was designed to transfer the entity's essence into her. The child laughs, a sound that echoes through the room and inside Ellie's head. "You've always been here," the child says, her voice merging with the murmurs. You just didn't know it. Ellie's vision blurs and she collapses to the floor, the child's laughter ringing in her ears. Ellie wakes up in her bed, disoriented and drenched in sweat. The murmurs are quieter now, but they're still there, a constant undercurrent of sound. She looks in the mirror and sees her reflection staring back at her, but something is off. The reflection's eyes are darker, colder. As she turns away, the reflection smiles, a slow, sinister grin that sends a chill down her spine. The murmurs grow louder, and Ellie realizes with growing horror that the entity is no longer just in the mansion, it's inside her. Ellie waking up in the mansion, the murmurs now a constant, oppressive presence in her mind. The air feels heavier, and the walls seem to pulse faintly as if the mansion itself is alive. The locked door across the hall is slightly ajar, and the symbols carved into it glow with an eerie, faint light. Ellie feels a strange pull as if the mansion is guiding her somewhere. She follows the sensation, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The murmurs grow louder, blending into a cacophony of voices that seem to come from all directions. Ellie's exploration leads her to a hidden passage behind a loose panel in the study. The passage is narrow and dark, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. She descends a set of crumbling stone stairs, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. At the bottom of the stairs, she finds an underground chamber filled with dozens of mirrors. The mirrors are old and tarnished, their surfaces reflecting distorted images of the room. As Ellie approaches, she sees that each mirror reflects a different version of herself. Some crying, some laughing, some screaming in terror. As Ellie examines the mirrors, one of the reflections, a version of herself with hollow black eyes, steps out of the mirror and attacks her. The reflection's movements are fluid and unnatural, its touch cold and clammy. Ellie fights back, her heart pounding as she struggles to break free. The reflection whispers, "You can't escape. You're one of us now," before dissolving into a pool of shadow. The other reflections in the mirrors begin to laugh, their voices merging into a chilling chorus. Ellie returns to the main floor of the mansion, shaken but determined to uncover the truth. She is surprised to find Elias Graves, the historian from the town library, standing in the foyer. He explains that he came to check on her after she didn't return his calls. Ellie tells him about the underground chamber and the mirrors, and Elias grows visibly uneasy. He admits that he's been researching the mansion's history and has uncovered something disturbing, a connection between Ellie's family and the mansion that goes back generations. Elias leads Ellie to the study, where he spreads out old documents and photographs on the desk. He reveals that Ellie's family has been tied to the mansion for generations. Her aunt, Maggie, wasn't the first to die there. Her mother did, under mysterious circumstances, shortly after giving birth to Ellie in the mansion. Ellie's mind reels as Elias explains that the entity has been using her family as vessels for its power for decades. The ritual Ellie performed wasn't just a trap. It was the latest in a long line of attempts to transfer the entity's essence into a new host. As Elias finishes his explanation, the lights flicker and the murmurs grow louder. The entity manifests as a shadowy figure, its form shifting and twisting as it advances on them. Elias tries to protect Ellie, but the entity overwhelms him, its shadowy tendrils wrapping around his body. Before he dies, Elias gasps, "You have to destroy it, Ellie, before it's too late." The entity consumes him, leaving nothing but a pool of shadow and a faint, lingering scream. Ellie stumbles back, her mind racing with fear and grief. The entity's voice echoes in her mind, "You can't destroy me. I am you." She looks in the mirror and sees her reflection staring back at her, but something is off. The reflection's eyes are darker, colder. As she turns away, the reflection smiles, a slow, sinister grin that sends a chill down her spine. The murmurs grow louder, and Ellie realizes with growing horror that the entity is no longer just in the mansion, it's inside her. Ellie waking up in her old apartment, the sunlight streaming through the windows. The murmurs are gone, and the oppressive atmosphere of the mansion is replaced by the familiar, comforting surroundings of her home. For a moment, she feels a wave of relief, convinced that the horrors of Maplewood Mansion were just a nightmare. As she gets out of bed, she notices small inconsistencies. The clock on the wall is stuck at 3:07, the air smells faintly of mildew, and the sunlight feels cold and artificial. She dismisses these details, attributing them to her frazzled state of mind. Ellie moves through her apartment, trying to shake off the lingering unease. As she makes coffee, she notices that the walls are beginning to crack, and the paint is peeling in long, jagged strips. The furniture looks older, more worn, and the air grows colder with each passing moment. She finds a newspaper on the kitchen table, its edges yellowed and brittle. The headline reads, "Local Artist Dies in Mansion Fire." The article describes the tragic death of Eleanor Carter in a fire at Maplewood Mansion, and the date on the newspaper is from the future. Ellie's mind races as she tries to make sense of the newspaper clipping. She picks up the phone to call for help, but the line is filled with static. When she finally hears a voice, it's her own, whispering, "You'll never leave." The voice grows louder, more insistent, and Ellie drops the phone, her hands trembling. The murmurs return, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. Ellie stumbles to the bathroom, hoping to splash water on her face and clear her mind. As she looks in the mirror, her reflection stares back at her, but something is off. The reflection's expression is cold and distant, and its eyes are darker, colder. The reflection mouths the words, "You're still here," before stepping out of the mirror and advancing on Ellie. She backs away, her heart pounding, and the reflection dissolves into a pool of shadow, leaving her alone in the decaying apartment. As Ellie tries to gather her thoughts, there's a knock at the door. She opens it to find a stranger, a woman with hollow eyes and a haunted expression. The woman introduces herself as Clara Bennett, a survivor of Maplewood Mansion. Clara explains that the entity creates elaborate illusions to keep its victims trapped, feeding on their despair. She warns Ellie that the only way to break free is to confront the entity and destroy the mansion. Ellie and Clara work together to break the illusion. Clara gives Ellie a symbol from the mansion, a small, intricately carved pendant, and tells her to focus on it. As Ellie holds the pendant, the apartment begins to dissolve, the walls crumbling into shadow. The murmurs grow louder, and Ellie feels a sharp pain in her chest as if something is being torn from her. She closes her eyes and focuses on the pendant, and when she opens them, she's back in the mansion, standing in the foyer. Ellie looks around the mansion, her mind reeling from the experience. The murmurs are quieter now, but they're still there, a constant undercurrent of sound. She looks in the mirror and sees her reflection staring back at her, but something is off. The reflection's eyes are darker, colder. As she turns away, the reflection smiles, a slow, sinister grin that sends a chill down her spine. The murmurs grow louder, and Ellie realizes with growing horror that the entity is no longer just in the mansion, it's inside her. Ellie standing in the foyer of Maplewood Mansion, the murmurs a constant, oppressive presence in her mind. The air is thick with tension, and the walls seem to pulse faintly as if the mansion itself is alive. Ellie knows that the time has come for the final confrontation. She gathers the items she needs, a silver dagger, a vial of her own blood, and the pendant Clara gave her, and prepares to set the mansion on fire. Her hands tremble as she arranges the items, her mind racing with doubt and fear. As Ellie sets the first flame, the entity manifests as a shadowy figure, its form shifting and twisting as it advances on her. The murmurs grow louder, blending into a cacophony of voices that seem to come from all directions. The entity reveals that it has been using Ellie as a vessel all along. The ritual in Chapter 4 was successful, and the entity has been slowly taking control of her body. "You can't destroy me," the entity whispers, its voice echoing in Ellie's mind. "I am you." Ellie's reflection steps out of a mirror, its movements fluid and unnatural. The reflection's eyes are darker, colder, and its expression is one of pure malice. It advances on Ellie, its touch cold and clammy. Ellie fights back, her heart pounding as she struggles to break free. The reflection whispers, "You can't escape. You're one of us now," before dissolving into a pool of shadow. The other reflections in the mirrors begin to laugh, their voices merging into a chilling chorus. Ellie realizes that the only way to destroy the entity is to sacrifice herself. She sets the mansion on fire, the flames spreading quickly through the old, dry wood. The entity's voice grows louder, more insistent, but Ellie focuses on the pendant Clara gave her, using it to anchor herself to reality. As the flames consume the mansion, Ellie feels a sharp pain in her chest as if something is being torn from her. The entity's voice echoes in her mind, "You can't kill me. I am you." Ellie wakes up in the hospital, disoriented and drenched in sweat. The murmurs are quieter now, but they're still there, a constant undercurrent of sound. She looks in the mirror and sees her reflection staring back at her, but something is off. The reflection's eyes are darker, colder. As she turns away, the reflection smiles, a slow, sinister grin that sends a chill down her spine. The murmurs grow louder, and Ellie realizes with growing horror that the entity is no longer just in the mansion, it's inside her. A wide shot of Maplewood Mansion engulfed in flames, its towering structure collapsing into a heap of ash and rubble. Firefighters and police swarm the scene, their voices muffled by the crackling of the fire and the wail of sirens. The townsfolk of Black Hollow watch from a distance, their faces a mix of relief and unease. News reports confirm that the mansion has been destroyed and that Eleanor Ellie Carter is presumed dead in the fire. The screen fades to black and the murmurs, now faint but unmistakable, linger in the background. Ellie wakes up in a sterile hospital room, disoriented and drenched in sweat. The murmurs are quieter now, but they're still there, a constant undercurrent of sound. Her body aches and her mind feels foggy as if she's been asleep for a long time. A nurse enters and explains that Ellie was found unconscious near the ruins of the mansion, the only survivor of the fire. Ellie tries to ask questions, but the nurse avoids giving details, her expression uneasy. As Ellie recovers in the hospital, the murmurs grow louder, more insistent. She hears faint whispers in the hallways, sees shadowy figures in the corners of her vision, and feels a cold draft even in the warm, sterile room. One night, she wakes up to find her reflection in the window staring back at her, its expression cold and distant. The reflection mouths the words, "You're still here," before dissolving into shadow. Ellie is discharged from the hospital, but she can't shake the feeling that something is wrong. She returns to the ruins of Maplewood Mansion, the charred remains of the structure looming like a skeleton against the gray sky. As she walks through the rubble, she finds the locked chest from Chapter 3, now open and empty. The symbols carved into the chest are scorched but still faintly visible, and the murmurs grow louder as she approaches. Ellie picks up a shard of broken mirror from the rubble, her reflection staring back at her. At first, everything seems normal, but then she notices a shadowy figure standing behind her in the reflection. The figure's form is indistinct, but its eyes glow faintly, and its presence sends a chill down Ellie's spine. She turns around but no one is there. When she looks back at the mirror, the figure is gone, but the murmurs grow louder, more insistent. Ellie stands in the ruins of the mansion, the murmurs a constant, oppressive presence in her mind. She looks at the shard of broken mirror one last time, her reflection staring back at her. As the camera pans to her reflection, the shadowy figure reappears, its form more distinct now. The figure's eyes glow faintly, and its presence sends a chill down Ellie's spine. Ellie whispers, "I'm still here," as the screen fades to black, leaving the audience questioning whether Ellie survived, or if the entity now wears her face.